Good afternoon. Oh, can everybody hear me? I'm having an echo. No? Can everybody hear me? There is an echo, isn't it?
We can hear you.
Okay. For some reason, I'm getting another voice. What is it? They have to turn something on. Yeah. Apologize for that. We were here, but we had a little bit of technical difficulties here, so everything's all set. So, moving right along, and welcome to that familiar face there, Commissioner Sawchuk. How are you?
I'm great. How are we doing?
Good.
Thanks for having me back.
The second item on the agenda is briefing on training at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy, police practices, tactics, training, and in the use of force, and investigations on the use of deadly force by law enforcement. Commissioner Sawchuk will be joined by Attorney General Fry, I believe. You can join in any time, Attorney General. Can you see me, Attorney? Attorney General Fry. It's a long name. Okay, we're all set? So between yourself, Commissioner, or the Attorney General, if either of you wish to make a statement or go right into your presentation, we'll entertain that. So we thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator, for having us back. Hopefully you enjoyed your lunch, got out a little bit before you came back for the afternoon. I just want to ask one question. I do have an answer for, I don't want to break the rules. I do have an answer for a few of the questions that were hanging after the last session or last question. Do you want me to try to answer those now or wait till the end or whatever works?
Now is fine, Commissioner. Go right ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I do think they're pretty straightforward. Is the federal funding contingent on immigration enforcement? And the answer is no. Point blank no on that one. The explicit bias, the systemic racism question from Representative Talbot Ross. So that information is within the privacy policy and within the suspicious activity training that those folks receive, that they're not to enter anything in the system solely based on race, gender, sex. I did not hear a specific training reference to that. So I think that's something that we can look at, Rachel, because that's the question you asked me. So the answer is no, but I think it's it's definitely explicitly entered in the various policy statements that they're not allowed to do that. But that's not what you asked me. So hopefully that helps there. And I think drawing a direct line, Representative Hickman, I'll have to do a little bit more work on that. I think routinely we have bulletins that go out and then they come back as a wanted bulletin, and then 2 days later it comes back canceled, subject in custody, a missing person that goes out, and then 2 days later we say found, and then they take them out of the system. But I'll have to do some more work to try to quantify that a little better as far as a success rate or the value of the work that they're doing. And then the very first question that took me a couple minutes to get figured out on my end, purely on my end, is so the MIAC conducts audits every 6 months based on the information that they utilize and that they move around in the system. So these audits include using something called randomizer.org to randomly pull 3% of the products that we have in our system. So in a particular audit, as part of the 3% was this form 2641, which the good representative had mentioned specifically. And so the auditors looked at that form, which is essentially an Intel chat amongst analysts in the Northeast. They kind of went through, they have that physically in their hand. They go, okay, so let's look at this document. And then they use a template, an audit template that the Department of Homeland Security provides. And then the MIAC created a form from that. And they have a bunch of questions. So they look at those questions, and then they look at the document, they compare them. And then the 17A and the 18 in particular, 17A being, did that report include the categories that you would mention? And in that particular report, the answer was yes. And 18 is, was it appropriate that that information was included in that 2641? And the information was yes. So the reason that 2641 and that audit is out, that was FOA information that we released. And that's also information that's now on the website because it's public. So I'm assuming that's where the representative saw that. In either regard, I talked to the lieutenant that was that runs that unit during the break time, and that's the information I got on that. Hopefully, that's deep enough. If not, again, those folks are available to me. I think that answers all of our questions that were out there. But
I would say to the members that, and I see where Representative Talbot Ross is online here, but rather than rehash what we just did for a few hours, I'll let Talbot Ross make a statement, but if anybody else has any follow-up questions, please reserve them for at the end of the meeting. Thank you. So Representative Talbot Ross.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Senator. And thank you for getting that information to us as quickly as you did, Commissioner Shostak. So I understand you're going to get back to us around the training curriculum piece, again, not on implicit or racial bias, but specifically around systemic racism. And then my only question around the funding and from the feds is, even if it's not contingent on the federal money, do you still cooperate with immigration enforcement? Regardless of money, is that one of your partners, immigration enforcement?
The U.S. Border Patrol does have an individual that is assigned to the MIAC. That is correct.
And the information that you're sharing, this will be my last question, but the information that is being shared, are those, that information was contained in the 45? I'm trying to track the information. Was that contained in one of the 45 that you mentioned earlier?
Reference to suspicious activity reports, you mean the 45 that went to the federal government?
Yes.
The examples that I have seen, no. There was a school threat scenario that was in there. There was 3 cybersecurity issues. I can try to get a more comprehensive view at that 45 specifically. That's not specific to border issues or border patrol or immigration. That's suspicious activity overall. But I can dig into that a little bit and see what I can find out.
I would definitely like to know that information. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you for the opportunity, Senator Shambo.
All right, we shall proceed, and it's up to the Attorney General or the Commissioner to begin or make a presentation. And again, the same format will follow. One question followed after everybody has asked that one question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. If it's okay with the Attorney General, I think the number one or the primary question under number 2 there is training and policies and procedures. I thought I'd start with that, if that's okay with you, Aaron.
I agree that makes sense because then that leads to the discussion about the use of deadly force by law enforcement in those investigations. So I think that makes sense for purposes.
Thank you very much for that, sir. And also the last little component of question 2 talks about the use of deadly force by law enforcement, the investigation of that. That's not something that the DPS is involved with. That is an Attorney General function. So between that and the deadly force review panel, I think would be the next topic. So if we could go back in, I'm happy to discuss training, policies, procedures, that kind of stuff in this next block. So thank you for that. I'm going to use the informational document that you have available to you, I hope have available to you. And again, that's a joint product between the Department of Public Safety, the Maine Chiefs of Police Association, and Maine Sheriffs. I'm just going to kind of use this very similar to I did the initial PowerPoint. Not going to read this stuff verbatim. You've already prepped, I'm sure, if you had it in advance. But I just want to hit some of the high points. To me, it's most important that I answer any questions that you can, anything that you have, or can try to get back to you. So whatever works for you works for me. But to touch on this, it's a little bit outside of training, but it's definitely the topics of the day that we're discussing with our community members and the questions that we're receiving via the media or emails from community members. So to dive in here a little bit, to talk about overview of hiring, in Maine, we have a 300-hour program, which is a pre-service or reserve officer program. You have to have completed that before you can work a minute as a law enforcement officer on the streets, by yourself in Maine. And if you go to the full-time academy, that's a 720-hour course, an 18-week academy that needs to be completed within that first year. So you're not allowed to work until you have those proper certification levels. But for us, for hiring, there are, in fact, specific guidelines that the state of Maine utilizes, and that includes a physical fitness test that is consistent across the board. It also includes a job suitability, so going to speak with a psychologist to see if you're suitable for the work, and a polygraph exam as well. There's other steps that may be a little bit more flexibility around an interview process, backgrounds. There's a component of backgrounds that's very strictly guidelined by the Board of Trustees as well. So there's multiple steps around that. I mentioned I may not have mentioned actually this morning, but it's a routine that we hire less than 5% of the people that apply. And that just speaks to the process in question. Always looking to get better, always looking to evolve, always looking for that next level. But I can tell you that there are other states like Massachusetts and New York, right, a Northeast nexus here, that don't require polygraphs. So we'll get, somebody that has experience in another community out of state that then comes up to Maine and finds out that there's a polygraph. It's a whole new process for them. So that's just some of the things that we do during hiring. There's a certification process. So there are disqualifying conduct that may be there around criminal activity, as an example, and some other things. Talk about law enforcement policies and procedures. And we put some information out yesterday from the Board of Trustees, because we did have a meeting last Friday, and that was a regularly scheduled meeting, had nothing to do with today at all, or last Friday's conversation from the law school. And we had implemented some policy changes to minimum standards through the Board of Trustees last Friday morning. So to touch on a few of these things, the Board of Trustees has had some responsibility over policies and procedures since the mid-90s. And we did a recent review. The Academy Director, Rick Disjardins, who was just announced as the full-time director on Friday, and Rick's a great guy and an incredible addition to the team. He pushed information out to the National Association of Academy Directors to see if other states, their boards, had any kind of impact whatsoever, had any kind of view on minimum standards. And they only had found one other state that actually did that work, and it happened to be New York. So to have that extra layer to say these minimum standards are an absolute necessity, everybody needs to have these. There's a bunch of other policies and procedures that are out there and should be, but there is certainly that core group that must be defined and are. So that's good information to have to provide some kind of uniformity. And agencies are required to report out annually that they do have those policies and that their officers have been trained. So that information comes back as of January 1. Those reports start coming in. Really, they come in probably 2 months later than that. But as far as January 1, they're supposed to be turning that information into us. So what happened on Friday? There was a few things that happened through the board, and I think they did a nice job, really, because they understand how timely this issue is and how important it is. And that we need to change things wherever we see them, is there a few things happen. One of those things is an addition to the minimum standards for the hate or bias crime policy. And the AG has actually mentioned this as a piece of the next conversation here, is that we put in minimum standards that law enforcement agencies must report any complaint of bias-based policing to the main office of the Attorney General's office. So that's a new minimum standard that was adopted on Friday the 19th and would be effective on September 1st. So it takes a little while because it goes from a minimum standard to then a model policy to then training the officers in question. And then January 1, they're responsible for reporting out to the academy. So that was a great addition. And it was something that the AG had recommended on his report out to the legislature that I think went out on March 16th of 2020. And then we have some other changes to the minimum standards around use of force. The first one, and this is now be affirmative language, very specific language. And the reason we did this is some of these things have existed already, but it's a shame because it shouldn't have taken us this long. But for us, we've always viewed the standard operating procedures as guidelines as in internal documents that our officers would look at and use their training and experience to interpret, right? So this is a policy, we train on it, we explain it, we discuss it, we may do scenarios on it. But we've never really looked at it as an external document where those we serve would look at that and go, wait a second, it doesn't say here that you can't do chokeholds except in these circumstances. And we may respond, well, you're right, it does not explicitly say that. It says it a different way, and somebody who's been to the academy and all these other things may understand it. But we just got to own the fact that that people are looking at these documents a different way than they have in the past. And that's absolutely the right thing to do. But that means we had to make some changes here as well to make it a lot easier to understand, if you will. So to go through these quickly, you'll have a lot of questions, I'm sure, afterwards. But the use of chokeholds or similar methods are not acceptable or approved means of arrest, restraint, and control unless deadly force is authorized. That's been the case since the 90s. The academy doesn't teach strangleholds or chokeholds. It's not a certified technique for arrest and control and restraint. It has been and continues to be, however, an effective tool if you're authorized deadly force. So there's very few scenarios where you're actually authorized deadly force. You could use that, but you're not taught that in the academy. You're not, there's no follow-up trainings on that. It just hasn't been that way, but we need to explain it a different way. Officers must intervene and report to supervisors when they see any other officer using unreasonable or unnecessary force. There's a lot of policies across the state that talk about code of ethics and course of conduct, but we don't explicitly say that in a use of force policy. And now we do to say there is a duty to intervene and to report that to a supervisor. Discharging a firearm in a moving vehicle is prohibited unless deadly force is authorized. Shooting at a moving motor vehicle has always been in the definition of deadly force, but you wouldn't know that, right? How would somebody know that if they picked up a policy? So we put that in the use of force policy itself in a standalone line that says discharging a firearm is prohibited unless deadly force is authorized. So somebody's trying to run you down in a car or they're shooting out of a car at somebody, whatever the crazy scenario would be, you would be authorized to use deadly force in that scenario. If they're escaping, they're driving off in a car, you would not. It's just not a scenario that would be functional. You'd have to be authorized to use deadly force. Requires de-escalation techniques when feasible. And you may look at that and go, when feasible, what is that supposed to mean? The scenarios may be if somebody's swinging a bat at you, or you walk in and now there's a deadly force situation, it may not be feasible to try to de-escalate situations. But the vast majority of circumstances, it absolutely is feasible. And we'll talk about de-escalation a little further down in that informational packet. Excessive force may never be used, point blank, period. It's expressly and affirmatively stated in the policy. Officers must monitor an individual in their custody for evidence of injury or medical distress and request emergency medical aid anytime somebody in your custody appears injured or in medical distress. So let's make sure if they're in the back of your back seat, you're going to jail, you're going to the hospital, you have to keep an eye on those folks. And that's existed in a lot of different policies, but now it's point blank in black and white in the minimum standards. Excited delirium is something that's been discussed in a last number of years around methamphetamine use and some of these other bath salts and some other things that create excited delirium. And we wanted to make sure, again, we expressly put that information in a minimum standard. So those are the policy changes that were made on last Friday, during last Friday's meeting. And then I'll dive right back into to that informational document. So overview of training. You know, another thing to me, all this stuff was great to push through the board and unanimous votes across all these issues. But the one I really got excited about that I think can have a drastic impact on law enforcement moving forward is that the board also authorized us to look at a workload analysis and a strategic plan for the academy. The reality is that the academy hasn't had a workload analysis since 2004. So that's 16 years since we last looked at what police officers actually do on the street. And many of you have done these before in your various worlds, but that's actually surveying things. And what we talk about is what Representative Morales had asked about. So how do you spend your time? Really, where does that go? And if you're spending all your time in this category, why is that only 4 hours of training at the police academy? Shouldn't that be 20 hours of training while something else is 2, right? So we need to look at that and we need to formalize that process. That's what a workload analysis will provide for us. And the strategic plan, to me, is a much broader issue, but incredibly important as well. You can agree or not agree, but I can tell you that the academy didn't have a capital improvement budget for the last during the last administration for 8 years straight. So we've got some maintenance we need to do there if we want to change the way we do business overall. So I'm talking about a potential change to the concepts around the academy. I think they do a good job now. We can do a better job. We've got amazing people over there that are trying to do the best they can and truly are, and have really stepped up to the plate during COVID. And we've learned a lot with COVID. We've learned about virtual platforms. We've learned about virtual testing processes, which means that we should have a broader impact around the state. Should somebody in Aroostook County have to drive 6 hours to come to Vassalboro to take a test in 2020? Absolutely not. Can we utilize virtual platforms to do some of the baseline work and then maybe bring folks into the academy to do some of the more hands-on or in-face trainings? Sure, I think we could absolutely do that. The average academy across the country is 20 to 21 weeks. We are currently at 18. What's that going to look like and what are we going to teach? So I think there's a lot of openings there, a lot of opportunity for us to look at our model and try to get better. And we're always trying to do that. We're far from perfect, but boy, we got some good folks over there that are trying to do it right, and I'm proud of them. So I think they do a good job across the board. So that's the 720 hours basic training. And then on top of that, every 2 years, so really 20 hours a year, law enforcement does refresher training or mandated training through the board. And on top of that, you have a bunch of other trainings that officers or departments rather mandate. And some of those mandated training in recent years are listed in that document. I'm not going to read them to you because I don't want to waste your time. And then if folks don't comply with these training requirements, then they can lose their certification. They can be suspended. There's a lot of different options that a group can work through rather. Certification of law enforcement officers, another national conversation and something we definitely wanted to touch on here. For revocation for misconduct, there is a complaint review committee through the Board of Trustees that looks at complaints against law enforcement officers and corrections officers across the state. So they review those on a regular basis. The Board of Trustees meets every 2 months. And that complaint committee, depending on the workload, meets a lot more often than that. So that's changed over the years as well. We were doing this since before 1992, and then 1992 forward, there's a different approach to the way they do the certifications and reviews. But again, that information is present. And a violation of that certification could be anything from training to committing a crime, an ethics violation. So there's a lot of different versions of that. And I have some baseline information about what that looks like, and somebody will probably ask me that. So happy to dive back in when that's appropriate. You know, for us, our academy puts information, because again, there are states around the country that don't certify their police officers at all. There's no certification process. Therefore, there's no decertification process. So there's nothing they could submit to a national database. For us, there is no national database, but there is an international association of academy and post directors that does house this style information. So we submit all the folks that we revoke their certifications, we submit that to that national database. Would be open to a conversation around a full-blown national database? We're already doing it now. It's just maybe somebody else is housing that. So that's just something to think about. Chokehold, strangleholds, I touched it in the policy. So I'm not going to dive into it in a separate item. Just simply to say we don't teach it. We do teach how to defeat it. As far as a technique, somebody's choking you, what would you do to counter that? But we don't teach it during our mechanical arrest, restraint, and control 57-hour block total during the basic training academy. De-escalation, I want to talk about the definition of de-escalation a little bit, because de-escalation is broader. People would naturally look at that and go, you're using your verbal skills to de-escalate a situation. And as somebody who taught tactical communications or verbal judo for a number of years, one of the primary instructors down south that brought it to the state of Maine in about 2001, we talk about verbal de-escalation skills and the actual techniques, tactics that you would use in an 8-step car stop or a 5-stop hard style. Because we expect police officers, we expect human beings to just know naturally how to de-escalate people. And that's not appropriate. We need to give them the skill set that's necessary, in fact, to do that. And those skills exist. But there's also other sides of de-escalation. And that means, can I provide time and space? If I go into this situation by myself, is that going to cause things to escalate? Or maybe I have one other officer and then people slow down a little bit by command presence. And as funny as it may sound, there are studies nationally to talk about de-escalation. If you look in shape, you sound good, you're professional, you seem like you're on the ball, then people go, well, maybe there's not going to be a fight here. And that would make common sense, right? I'm not going to mess with this particular individual. If they just are using common sense, they're polite, they're using their verbal skills, they just seem to want to work through a problem. Because if an officer rolls in a situation just like anybody else, and they're trying to push buttons, they're trying to cause a problem, that's obviously counterintuitive to what we want to do around de-escalation. So there's a lot of conversations around that as a skill set. Another topic that is in here, Representative Warren is obviously on the call and has been all day, but we talk about mental health first aid. Senator Rosen, Representative Warren were instrumental, I'm sure with others that were involved as signers, I guess, for that legislation in 2015 to get mental health first aid included and have 20% of our law enforcement folks around the state have that level of certification. So that's currently existing, and that's been in play at the Academy since 2015. That was a piece of that legislation, and we appreciate that. I think that's great. As somebody who's a major supporter of CIT and de-escalation across the board, I think that's great. And currently we've had 660-ish full-time officers come through the Academy and receive that 8-hour training. Many of them have gone on to the full 40-hour course, but I can't go by that without saying thanks, because that's a big deal and something that is widely supported across the board. Use of force continuum stuff. I would say that use of force continuum, based on terminology, talks about a step. And where law enforcement went to a situational use of force model about 15 years ago across the board. And that's, if I think of use of force continuums, mean we start here, we go here, we continue to work our way up. While a situational use of force, I look at it as somebody standing in a circle with all their resources around them, and they go, I need this right now, I'm going to transition to this, I'm going to go back to this. And that's the current model that you see around use of force around the country. And there's studies, there's information around why that would be important one over the other. And there's a lot of information around that situational use of force model and why folks went to that. Warning before shooting, again, that's one of those things that we've added to that model policy and to the mandated minimum standards rather. That's been recently debated in the Supreme Court, whether it's necessary or not. It's not based on statutes, but if it's feasible and you can warn somebody, then do that. If it's not feasible, again, because you walk into a situation and something happens immediately, then you just don't do it. You're just not in a situation where that's going to work all the time. Duty to intervene, I already touched on, but again, very important that officers be mandated. It's required that you intervene when necessary and that you report that to a supervisor. Not that you just did it and then forgot about it. Oh, just between me and you, just knock it off. Don't do that. The requirement is that you in turn report that to a supervisor. Touched on shooting and moving vehicles already. Comprehensive reporting of use of force. The National Use of Force Data Collection Program that the FBI implemented in January of 2019. The title itself, I think, can be a little confusing because really that database is intended for deadly force situations only, right? So it's not dealing with takedowns or holds or any of that stuff. It's deadly force only. And Maine has been contributing to that since its very beginning through the Attorney General's office. And the AG can discuss that further if he likes. But we've been submitting that information as they do investigations to that national system. And I say that because only 40% of departments really do nationally. So they've got a ways to go before they flesh out that particular system. And then there's other, there's processes around reporting of use of force and how, as an example, I'm coming from a system where a use of force occurred. A sergeant would look at it, a lieutenant would look at it, a major, a commander, assistant chief, a chief, and then it would go to a monthly review panel to look at, which included members of unions, a defensive tactics instructor. We would look at patterns and trends and say, what's going on here? We've seen a lot of this. Are we teaching that? Is that a best practice? Should we knock that off? Why do we have a bunch of newer officers running into a scene to deal with a situation where maybe they take 2 breaths, we get a couple officers, and just take it easy, and we work into a situation that way. So there's a bunch of different reviews. That, however, the review process is not, is not specific. My screen just changed, but now I'm seeing appropriations, but I think you can still hear me. So that, that's not consistent across the board. What is consistent is these are being reviewed at a multitude of levels. And the state police are very similar now at the Department of Public Safety in multiple levels of review to include their professional standards group. Pattern and practice investigations. Again, this is something that the Attorney General has worked on. That used to occur through the Civil Rights Division of DOJ, the Department of Justice. That has slowed down considerably. And again, you can have your opinion on that one way or the other. But they're not reviewing those cases on patterns and practice at the federal level at this point. A group of, I believe it was 18 AGs did submit a letter requesting the authority to do these at the state level. And to my knowledge, I don't think we've heard back on that yet, but I just mentioned that, and Aaron can certainly dive in. He's the pro on that category for sure. Independent investigations of use of force. Again, I think this speaks to deadly force scenarios, which we're going to touch on in the next block to include the deadly force review panel. So I'm not really going to touch on that either right now. But if you've got questions, I'm happy to try to do something with it. Touched on National Police Misconduct Registry already. Bias-based profiling training. So as I mentioned, that's a block of instruction at the basic school now, but it's only 2 hours long. And there's 2 hours on a couple other topics that are included in here: cultural diversity, implicit human bias, and civil rights. Now, there's a bunch of ancillary trainings around ethics, the moral conduct of law enforcement, and a bunch of different things around de-escalation and communication skills that I think fall into the category of de-escalation. But specifically around bias-based policing, I would say there's about 6 hours. So again, if we look at that workload analysis, we look at a strategic plan, we can look at that. We can have that conversation. How many hours should we add, or what should it be total? And what's that going to look like? So we're happy to do that for sure during that broader process here. No-knock warrants in general. I can tell you, I've done no-knock warrants, but it's been, I don't know, 15 years, I think, probably 18 years since I did one as a member of a tactical team, because tactics have changed and our approach to search warrants in general have changed. So initially, there was a big thought around everything was dynamic. So when you did a search warrant, if it was a rush, you hit the door, you go in, you try to clear the house as fast as possible so that people don't have access to weapons, so that they don't destroy evidence and other categories along the way. This is still an option, right? But you have to file an affidavit. Then the district attorney or prosecutor reviews that, and then it gets signed off by a judge, and then you're authorized to use that. But then tactical teams will look at that and do a risk assessment, actually score it out and say, well, is this really a tactical call? I got 4 points over here and 2 points over there. It doesn't meet our threshold of actually a threat against the community or against officers and a much lower level against evidence. So with that in mind, traditionally nowadays, rather than dynamic entries where everybody's rushing in the door to save evidence, and now we do something called surround and call outs, right? So you may set up a perimeter and you may call somebody, physically call them and go, hey, it's Mike. We need you to come out. You got a warrant. We're not leaving until we get this thing done, right? If it's more in an urban atmosphere, it may be something we call breach and hold, where you breach an inner door and then you hold and you say, hey, it's Mike. You got a warrant. We need you to come out. And then you start negotiating. You start talking about how are we going to facilitate a peaceful transition to whatever the issue is, search warrants, arrest warrants, or whatever you're trying to ultimately accomplish. So there's things like that. We also do some work, I'll tell you, and we hate to talk about tactics, but I'm just going to tell you, we wait for people to leave, right? If you leave the house and go down the road and then we end up pulling you over in a traffic stop, and we try to work it on that end, that's fine too. So there's options there that don't involve no knocks, and they're really not done that often nowadays. Body worn cameras, we can talk about that if you wish. I think those are really personal, community level conversations because there's obviously privacy issues, there's financial issues, there are a bunch of different things, and I implemented a policy or program in Portland before I left. They actually did the nuts and bolts after I left. The policy was completed. They've got over 100 cameras down there, and it appears to be working well. But it's not that you have a camera, it's can you release the information and what do you do with that I think is the broader conversation piece. Another topic here is certification level stuff, or rather accreditation, not certification. There are departments in the state that do national accreditation processes, CALIA stuff. And for the last 4 years, Maine Chiefs has been working on a state level accreditation process called MLEAP, Maine Law Enforcement Accreditation Program. So that's up and running now. To my knowledge, one department has done that and finished their accreditation process, the first one out of the box. We have some additional ones that are queued up, but not done quite yet. So that's a lot of me talking, and I apologize for that. I just wanted to go through that document as fast as I could between that and Board of Trustees policy minimum standard changes to provide some benchmarks for the rest of the conversation. And happy to do the best I can to answer any other questions. So thank you for that, and apologize if I was long-winded.
Thank you, Commissioner. Before I turn it over to questions from the members, Attorney General Fry, do you wish to make comment on what he just presented?
Not on what the commissioner just presented. When appropriate, I can talk about the investigations into use of deadly force and the use of force panel.
All right, thank you. Yes, I have Representative Reckett. Representative Reckett, you're on to ask a question, please.
Thank you.
Okay.
I think that most of the people on the Criminal Justice Committee know what my background has been vis-a-vis the Academy. Judiciary Committee may not know that. And so I just remind, first of all, I'm from District 31, which is the ocean end of South Portland. Sorry, I didn't say that the previous time. Basically, I served for 15 years on the Academy Board. And so I'm very aware of the procedures and the processes and how long they take and which the complaint committee is. And all of those kinds of things are sort of second nature to me when the commissioner reviewed them, because I've lived through a lot of it. And my job on the Academy Board was always to ask the hard questions, in addition to asking, you know, what's your experience violence, which was always probably important to understand that the level of changes that were instituted on Friday were in fact not always substantive changes, because they really already existed. But my experience with law enforcement, God bless them, is that unless you tell people exactly what it is that you want, and you say it in a way they can hear it, it's very difficult to get compliance. So I applaud the Academy Board for trying to bring these pieces up to the level of being paid attention to. And because I do believe that the vast majority of them, in any case, have been part of the standard operating the Academy. But this way, it's easier to say, these are the things, wham, and have them complied with. I also am very aware that there has been decertification in the Academy, and it is an active piece. And the complaint committee is a very active committee on the Academy Board. And when the complaint committee finishes acting, then the board itself has to get briefed and make a decision. The complaint committee doesn't make a final decision on decertification. So I think that I'm pleased with the articulation that happened in this compilation of what has recently happened. I have one other.
Representative Breckett, is there a
Yeah.
question there, or?
Yeah, there is.
Okay,
I want to know
thank
what the in regard to the standards for people who can become police officers that you articulated at the very beginning of what you said, the physical fitness standards. That my experience over the years has been that they really are difficult to comply with for particular populations, namely women. And I'm wondering whether or not there has been a look at them in the recent past as to their appropriateness for the current, the current, what's the phrase you use? That you're going to be trying to look at it. Yeah, the standards, but it's the what's required for the job. I mean, which?
Yeah, workload analysis, like a style of, are we
Workload-
actually testing at the right level?
Right, right. So is that part of the observation that's going to happen, that's going to be considered in this process, do you believe?
To me, that strategic plan would be geared towards a very comprehensive view. I think that physical fitness standards have changed over the years, and they are contingent on age and gender. There are different levels of different standards. And that piece has been, you know, as far as having different standards have been in place for as long as I can remember. But there are ways, as an example, new systems that are in place to make physical fitness testing very specific to a job function. You know, that's not necessarily the model we use with the push-ups, sit-ups, and run kind of scenario. So I think anything is on the table for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Representative Breckett. Next is Representative Corey, followed by DeVoe, followed by Senator Bellows.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the great sort of overview that was provided to us yesterday by the Maine Chiefs of Police, your office, and the Maine Sheriff's Association. I've had a constituent sort of go through this, and which is great. I don't know how she got her hands on it, but I'm happy she had a chance to read it. I know that Maine has a very high standard for certification through the academy. And you talked a little bit of that document about the National Decertification Index, and you had said that it's used in Maine and everything. How do we follow up on officers' conduct that may not rise to decertification in other states looking for certification in Maine? So if somebody moves here and they obviously have to apply through the academy and everything else to become an officer here, do we have a way of knowing if there was, misconduct that didn't rise to that level, or is that kind of information kind of, held on to by, employers like in a personnel type situation and everything else? How do we really follow up and make sure we're getting, the absolute best and not having, other states slough off, you know what I mean? Their problems on us.
Yeah, there are horrifying stories, of police officers that are problem police officers that are hopping from one agency to the next. Absolutely horrifying stories that make us cringe for sure. For us, somebody wants to be certified as a law enforcement officer in the state of Maine. What the academy will do is check that decertification database for starters, and then the department that wants to hire them in their background check, I can tell you for us, had a background investigator assigned to call and do all the follow-ups and get permission to look at personnel files and do all the work around that to make sure we weren't getting the proverbial bad eggs that now want to come up here to Maine. And I'll be honest with you, we asked the question, so you're coming from where to here? What's bringing you to Maine? What's going on? I got family connections, or I got whatever. Okay, appreciate it. We're always looking to figure out, we want the best people humanly possible. And despite the intense level of these backgrounds and this process, there's no question that we don't get everybody. And that's borne fruit as we decertify folks at the back half. So it is incumbent upon departments to do the proper background checks. And that means calling people, doing home visits, doing all that kind of work, because the academy would only really look at that certification level through the national database.
Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Corey. Representative DeVoe.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Commissioner. My question to you is where there's a lot of questions, basically from individuals, not only legislators, but outside of the law enforcement community. Would you find it important for those that sit on the criminal justice, maybe even judiciary, to come to the academy at the beginning of their term and actually go through a day at the academy to see the mechanics of arrest and control training, put them through the FAT simulator, the shoot, don't shoot simulator, things like that, so they can actually understand or get a very small snapshot of what it is for the law enforcement officers here in Maine, what they're going through?
Yeah, it's a great question, a great point, rather. And I do think that would be important. And I'll also tell you that, when the administration first hit the ground running, we were right mid-session and budget and the whole, and that's not just this administration. It happens right when there's a transition. And I think normally we would make that request and offer up an opportunity to come out and visit and do briefs on our various departments. And that didn't happen just because everybody was running 1,000 miles an hour. That invitation is absolutely open all the time. That FATS machine, that simulator machine, that's amazing to see. You want to walk through the crime lab and the computer lab, rather, computer crimes, and talk to those investigators about what they do and see some of the officers or the cadets, the trainees going through some of those scenarios. I think that's helpful. I think it's helpful to get out and probably equally as important, do ride-alongs in your own communities, right? So, and I know many people on here, I'm not saying that it doesn't happen because I know you're doing that work now, but that stuff is great to come from that side and meet the officers and see what they're up to. It's obviously also very incumbent upon us as sworn law enforcement officers to make that community connection as well and spend the time that we need on trust and relationships from the other side of the equation. It's absolutely imperative to move the conversation forward. But I absolutely agree with you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Bellows.
Thank you. Commissioner, thank you for the overview of what's happening in the academy with hiring and overall law enforcement. Representation is an important piece of breaking down institutional bias. And one of the things I'm curious about is what measures you are taking to recruit women, people of color, especially African Americans, lesbian, gay, transgender officers to serve in law enforcement.
Yeah, it's an amazing question. You know, I always think that, you know, the best way to put that is that we want our first responders, period, right? We want our legislators. We want all aspects of our society to mirror those we serve. So I think that's incredibly important, without question. I do think that we've had a difficult time. I can tell you that the Academy over the last couple of years has started to collect data about women in law enforcement. And now we're actively tracking that. And we're at a point where we do have the accurate information, and that's right around 8.9%, while the average around the country for law enforcement is right around 12.6, right? So we're low with women in law enforcement. We are also low on people of color within law enforcement. Again, no question. Now, the state of Maine at 1.6 versus some of our more urban atmospheres where those percentages are a little different. Everybody has the same hard time recruiting. Let me say recruiting, period, recruiting anybody for one, and then recruiting people of color to work. And I'll tell you that when I see the intelligence and the passion of folks that are at these protests and rallies and want to be involved, I hope that there are folks there in those groups that want to be part of the system and want to help all of us and want to better the system that will be serving their communities. I hope I see that down the road. I can tell you the outreach that we do with various communities, and I've asked people to say, hey, listen, I've, as an example, been in mosques and I'm talking to elders, and I said, listen, we want to mirror the community that we serve. What's the best way to get to good candidates? And I've had members of elders say, listen, Mike, that's great. We appreciate it, but you've got to wait 2 or 3 generations before anybody will be interested in law enforcement. And I'm like, sorry, but that doesn't work for me. I can't wait 2 or 3 generations to get somebody in. How do we do that, right? And so we're constantly doing outreach through our schools, through community organizations. Our best recruiters, the best way to get great people in the business are through the officers that are currently working, through our dispatchers that are currently working. You go on a call and you're like, wow, that person was sharp and articulate and seems to get it. Let's get that person in the mix. So we've also done some specific recruiting with universities out of state in certain publications that we think are better suited to bring people of color to Maine. But we've got a ways to go. Straight up own that all day long, is that we're not where we need to be at this particular time.
Thank you. And having worked for corrections, the same goes for correctional officers. We could use different ones. I was going to say Victoria, but yes, Representative Morales.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, I have a question I was going to ask, but I want to make a comment about the recruitment that Senator Bellows brought up, and then I'll save this question for the next round of questioning. So there's a police recruiting video in the city I live in South Portland, and it is, it's very militaristic, and it's sort of this SWAT team approach, and I think it's trying to attract a certain group of people who are interested in that style of policing. And I think I would argue that that's maybe not where today's young people are thinking about law enforcement, and they're not thinking about it in that way. And that's sort of one reason why I asked you about more of a public health response to law enforcement, particularly getting, representation from all of our communities who understand the harm that law enforcement has caused in their communities, in our Black and Brown communities, in our Indigenous communities, our LGBTQ communities, our disabled, particularly in schools. So I just think maybe the way that we're trying to recruit needs to be thought out very deeply with the communities to get their input on that. So any thoughts on that?
Yes, and I would agree with you there as well. I think that's evolved. I can tell you that the interview process itself has changed, right? Our questions have changed to really make sure that people, before they get involved in these processes, understand what law enforcement looks like today. Everybody's seen 1,000 made-for-TV movies, and everything gets solved in an hour, and everything has a blue light and foot chases and all this stuff that happens, when in fact, the vast majority of what we do does firmly fall into that service bucket. Now, the reality and the way I explain this is, to me, the debate in law enforcement about the warrior mentality versus the guardian mentality is done. It should be a guardian mentality, but the reality is you got to have a guardian mentality with your ability to get that warrior on in a heartbeat. When you look at active shooter scenarios and some of the violent stuff that can occur, it doesn't happen all the time. But we're asking our officers to go from 0 to 100 at various times and have the skill sets to address all those issues. So it's definitely a guardian mindset. The questions should be oriented towards communication skills, problem-solving skills. What cops do, in fact, is communicate, mediate situations, and facilitate broader systems. That's what we do for a living. And the good cops that I know are very good at all three of those. At the same time, you may run into a house at a domestic violence situation and be involved in a physical confrontation. You may get that call where somebody's armed with something and on the verge of hurting somebody. So there's definitely that piece where we have to acknowledge, we have to own that as well, and we have to properly train and equip our officers. But our primary focus, you may have some shiny lights and cars to draw somebody's attention, but you just got to own the fact that that's not what we do all the time. That workload analysis will bear that out for sure.
Just a quick question. You said you have the 2004 workload analysis. Would that be able to be shared with us?
That's the last time a workload analysis occurred. I haven't actually seen it, but I can try to get my hands on it.
Thank you.
I just got the high sign, so I think I can get that one for you.
Representative Hickman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Excellent. Commissioner, thank you again for being here. A hypothetical that I would like to ask you about, and it is this. If a law enforcement officer knows of another law enforcement officer who brags about all of the stops that he or she has done to people who are driving while black in the state of Maine, would that law enforcement officer have a duty to report that up the chain of command? And if so, what would be the recommended disciplinary action for that law enforcement officer who brags about racial profiling to his colleagues or her colleagues?
Well, I would say first and foremost, it's a valid question, but hypotheticals are problematic because the devils are often in the details. But yes, that officer would have a duty to report that conduct. And any kind of racial profiling or bias in law enforcement should result in a firing.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Next is Representative Talbot Ross.
Thank you so very much, Senator, and thank you, Commissioner. I appreciate you giving us an overview of some of the reforms that have just been put in place. But there's something that is still very troubling to me in all of this. And if it was as simple as, you know, a list of recent reforms, if it was as simple as that, then I'm not sure we would have such acute racial disparities that are the result of people not following their own standard operating procedures and our own laws. So I've got a lot of other questions as we move throughout the afternoon on training and curriculum and all of those things, Board of Trustees. But for right now, I just need to ask you if you believe that the Maine state policing that takes place in this state operates within institutional racism. And if your answer is no, then I'd like to know how you account for all of the racial disparities, which, by the way, didn't just start yesterday. They have been here since the art of policing. So question one is there racism within our policing in the state of Maine? If not, how do you account for the racial disparities when there's no proof that people of color have any more percentage of criminogenic behavior than white people? And three, if you answer yes, what are you going to do about it?
So to me, there's no reason for question number two. I think that systemic racism exists across systems. I think that all systems, to include law enforcement. I think that I understand that to be the case. I don't know the extent of that, however, and as we talk about data collection and other things, we should do that, and we should try to drill down to that level. But I firmly believe that implicit bias is something that exists everywhere, that systemic racism in educational systems and healthcare systems and criminal justice system, that exists. And I think that we are, in fact, having those conversations now and have had them a bunch of times in the past. And to be quite frank, we haven't made the reforms that we need to properly address the issues, or we wouldn't be here today. And I've heard you say eloquently in the last week that you said, what are we going to do next? Well, we need to talk about this from a system-wide perspective. So I think it's appropriate to deal with some, what I believe is short-term wins. Like, we can look at a policy, we can change a policy. Can we turn that oil tanker around on the dime? No. We've got to work with systems across the board. We've got to work together. And that process is really just beginning for this version of this conversation.
So I thank you. I'm not sure that, in all due respect, you answered the question. I'm not talking about other systems right now, although I do believe, like you, that this has to have an intersectional approach, because it's not just about policing. But my specific questions around, is there racism in our policing? That's the specific question. And if the answer is yes, then how do you think these new reforms get at eliminating the racial disparities in the system? I'm really being very specific about racism and not implicit bias and not anything else that's kind of unmeasurable and in the air. And I'm talking really specifically about systemic institutionalized racism in policing in the state of Maine, as evident with the racial disparities. And how do these new reforms that you just articulated, how do they get at the racial disparities in the system? If you agree, racism does exist in policing in the state of Maine.
I apologize. I thought I was pretty clear for that. Yes, it does exist. And two, that, I do think that as we look at policies and procedures, when you look at this nationally, a lot of the recommendations around this says that you reduce your use of force overall, which means if there's disproportionate minority contacts or a higher percentage of people of color where use of force is utilized, if you make these changes, in fact, you make everybody safer, but you would automatically make people of color safer. Because if they're used, in fact, more against people of color, and we reduce that usage or we ban certain usage, then you've made them automatically safer.
Okay, and then one just last thing before we move on. It's not a question.
Are those follow-up questions?
No, I just want to make it.
There's more than one in there, so could we?
No, I don't have any more questions.
Okay.
I just have a comment about the fact that, Commissioner, with all due respect, you do not have to wait several generations to diversify your police force or any institution here in the state of Maine, because African Americans have been here before statehood, before 1820. So you've had a couple of 100 years to try to do that, with all due respect. Thank you.
Well, and with all due respect, Representative, I appreciate that. And we have continued to try to do that work. That was one example that I gave about a specific conversation that I had with one community. So I agree with you completely. That's not a debate, and that wasn't my intent by any means to somehow imply that. We've been attempting to hire folks for a long, long time, and we need to continue to do that and do a better job at it. So I appreciate it.
Thank you kindly.
I have Representative DeVoe next.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Sawchuk. Someone who has served in law enforcement and have worked with a number of different departments. I also have talked with many sheriffs and police chiefs. So I guess I kind of want to follow up on some of the discussion that was with prior to the representatives. Do you find that there's a shortage in law enforcement officers, period?
Yes.
And have you gone out to just one race and asked them to come to work?
No, sir.
You target everyone.
Yes, sir.
And you're still having a shortage.
Yes.
And so do you think that it's fair to say that disparaging numbers that currently are within the law enforcement community is because of, as was said, systematic racism? Or is it that individuals are just not applying to become law enforcement officers?
I think overall, people aren't applying to become law enforcement officers for a lot of different reasons. I would also say that I do believe there are those that are people of color that would look at it and consider to have additional hurdles, like why would I be part of that kind of a system? So I think that does exist as well, but we have a hard time across the board.
And that's my point here, is that we're trying to blame it on one issue when it's realistically the individuals that aren't making the decision to go into law enforcement. And why the hell would they want to now when law enforcement is looked at so negatively?
I don't have to answer that. You know, that's a comment, that's a feeling, and I think I've allowed it to happen with others. I will not let it continue.
Oh, because it's
we have to be very, you've made your point. This is not going to be a statement, and I just would ask that you make a specific question or phrase it and move on.
Certainly.
That's all I'm asking.
Do you think that the police departments are racist in their employment of individuals?
No, I do not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeVoe. Next is Representative Warren.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Again, thank you, Commissioner, for being here. My question is specifically around the data problem that we seem to have in Maine. And I know that, you had stated earlier that Representative Morales asked for some data and we're trying to track it down. I also heard the changes that are made at the academy, and I appreciate those statements about going to your supervisor if there's a complaint, etc. I heard those. But what I'm trying to get at is who is going to lead the actual collection of data that we need in this state in order to, because we know it's happening, right? We know that there's racial disparity in every level of the criminal justice system. And we know that the farther that you go into the system, the deep end, as we might refer to it, Warren, Windham, the disparity gets larger. That's just fact. We can't debate it, that the data has been collected to show us that that's the result. What we don't have enough of is the data to help us figure out how do we stop it. And somebody in some position in Maine has got to lead on actually giving us a good picture of data. Is that person going to be you? Or is it going to be somewhere else? Is this something you've talked about? I really hope it can be a result of the work that we're trying to do together.
Well, I'm happy to continue that conversation for sure. I think that when we look at the overall picture of data collection in Maine, we do have to be honest and forthright to say that there's 13 records management systems if you're asking, do I think we should mandate that another community spends millions of dollars to switch over to a different system? I'm not in a position to mandate that unfunded mandate to another community at this point. I can tell you that the state has definitely looked at this around, I could think 3 or 4 different times over the years around data collection and records management systems, and it's in the millions of dollars. When we switched over to a Spielman records management system a few years ago, that's a 10-year contract, that's $10 million total. That impacts about 770 officers. That means that there's about 2,800 officers or so that aren't under that system. So if your question is, should the state of Maine foot the bill so that everybody can transition over to one system, then I guess we should float that to discuss it. I know there's going to be a lot of budgetary conversations, moving forward for sure.
Representative Cooper?
Thank you. Thanks. Okay. Thank you. Commissioner, I'm sure you've heard the slogan that's being voiced by protesters these days, defund the police, which I think is a misleading and erroneous way to look at it. That really what people are talking about is demilitarizing the police. And you and I and the other members of the committee have talked repeatedly during the course of our hearings about using people with or outside of the police department to handle certain responsibilities which are not strictly law enforcement. There are more mental health issues, substance abuse issues, dealing with children, and all kinds of things that are better dealt with by people with specialized training in escalating confrontations and dealing with the underlying problem. So in terms of recruitment, it may very well be, in my uneducated position, not being involved in the police force, that you're not getting the kind of diversity that you're looking for because you are looking for military types. And if you
we have a question. That's a statement.
Policing work so that it includes that military aspect, but most of the work is of the other sort, and people can apply for and specialize in that more community-oriented work. You will have greater success in getting people from those communities to work with you on all the issues that face the community that involve a threat to our community. So I'd wonder if you would comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I think that, I can tell you this, that as far as good cops that I've worked with, I just have officers.
Could somebody turn the sound up? I can't.
We lost you.
You got me back. There you go. So thank you for saying that before I got 10 minutes deep. So I can tell you that as an example for hiring, that I know police officers that were officers of the year that were mechanics before they became cops. I know police officers that are attorneys, passed the bar, worked in that field, and now they're attorneys. I know, and not one of them is better than the other. They're good people, first and foremost, and they are keyed in on compassion and communication skills and everything across the board. Hiring processes that I've been involved with directly are not focused on the militarization component of things. You do have to be able to respond in some crisis situations with a mindset that you can, in fact, deal with violence if necessary, with trauma as necessary. But that doesn't mean you have to be have a military mindset. I say that as somebody who was in the Marine Corps for 5 years and then retired as a police officer. I think we need the entire spectrum of folks to be in the mix in order to have a well-rounded police department. Demilitarization, I think, again, is a little different than defunding in my mind and the way I've had that explained to me. But I hear exactly what you're saying, and specifically to recruiting, I would agree with you that, I don't think we're looking for a military mindset, but that's not to say that we don't have great veterans that come out of the military services that are used to working with systems and working in that atmosphere that do an amazing job, because they absolutely do. Sure, are we looking for folks that have that can work as a team, that are used to stressful situations and long hours, and the mindset around military in other countries has changed a great deal as well around a community policing concept that they're utilizing. And there's a lot of very, very positive things that the veterans bring to the table as well. So,
well, I would only if I could just comment. Sorry, if I could just comment. I think if I'm hearing you correctly, you're saying that a police officer should have all those skills and be ready to do all those skills. I'm saying not so. Some people are better at de-escalating, bringing in mental health services, treating substance abuse. Some people are better at knowing how far they should go in the use of force. So
thank you, Representative.
Look at it in a more compartmentalized way. Will aid your recruitment effort, will de-escalate violence within the system, and may also reduce the racial disparities that we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we have Representative Harnett next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you again, Commissioner. I want to talk a little bit about data and data collection, but I don't want us to lose the forest from the trees. And let me try to explain. About 6 years ago, I served on a large task force when I worked at the Office of the Attorney General on bias-based profiling and racial disparities in law enforcement. And I heard back then, well, we can't get the data because we have these different communication systems that don't talk to one another. So we're having a hard time collecting that information. Here we are 6 or 7 years later. And the data that I'm concerned about is I just went online this morning to look at the incarceration rates in the state of Maine. In Maine, we incarcerate 140 of 100,000 white people in the state. When it comes to blacks, we incarcerate 839 per 100,000. That's a 599% difference. We have the proof. The proof is in the makeup of our prisons. And I'm not saying we don't need more data to find out why that's happening, but we can't forget, we know it is happening. Today, we have blacks incarcerated at a rate of 600% more than whites. What do we do about that now, other than bemoaning the fact that we have these different communication systems that don't talk to one another? We know it's happening. What do we do now to change those numbers?
So I think that for us, the short-term wins here are, again, around policies and procedures and workload analysis and strategic plans to change the way we train and change our focus in many regards, which is what I think can, in fact, be effective. And I think as this conversation continues, there are other recommendations that I think we should obviously be looking at and work together to develop. I don't think that as the Commissioner of Public Safety, you're looking at me today on June 24th as a single person and asking me for the answer to that question. I do think we'll be working with a larger group, certainly through the administration and the legislature, to develop exactly the plans that you're referring to, sir.
I guess what I'm asking, I appreciate that response. We have a rate of 600% more blacks in jail in Maine today. There has been a huge human capital that has resulted from that level of incarceration. I think we have to look at it as more than just collecting data and changing policies. Why do we have so many people in prison? I looked at global incarceration figures today. The United States has 25% of the world's population of incarcerated people, and we are by far and away the most highly incarcerated country in the world. I think part of what we need to look at is, why is that? Why is our response to incarcerate more human beings than any other country on the face of the earth in the year 2020?
You know, sir, you've been around a long time, right? So we had a bunch of task forces in this last session that came back with a bunch of recommendations. And the legislature had an opportunity to vote on what they wanted to see implemented or not implemented. I would continue to say that there are a lot of great ideas that were on the table, and, you know, could be about bail reform, could be around so those things were on the table. And the legislature had that opportunity to vote on them. And I'm sure you're going to have another opportunity to vote on them again. So I think, you know, largely the question you're asking from a global perspective can be found in a lot of those topics that were covered extensively in this last session. Everybody, and I say everybody, it was a lot of amazing task force work, a lot of information that was flying around above and beyond data, and there was still a strong focus on data or a lack thereof in those settings. I think you have the opportunity to impact that answer personally and professionally.
Thank you.
As do I, for that matter.
As we all do.
Correct.
And
yes,
must.
Representative Harnett, I just want a clarification because that's something I'm very interested in. I want to be clear. When you said 600% in prisons, are you including county jails or just state facilities? Not that it makes a big lot of difference, but that's a large number. I wanted to be clear.
It is a large number, and I will get you that answer. I'm not certain as I sit here right now.
I can share with you that Commissioner Liberty last week, and it was startling for me to hear this. In our state prisons, we have 1,800 plus inmates. It used to always be 2%, 5%, 10%. So we're up to 11.2% of that 1,800 Black population. So it was startling for me to hear that, and I've not forgotten that. So thank you very much for bringing it up.
You're welcome.
Made one mistake, just one. I let one person speak twice in the one question. If we're all done, if everybody who had a question already asked it, I can now say anybody can follow up. So let's follow up. Representative Corey is next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a question. You talked a little bit in the sort of overview that you had given, you know, with regard to the CIT training. And for those of us on the Criminal Justice and Public Safety Committee, we know that a lot of that ends up getting provided through NAMI. But as I remember, we had a bill and it kind of showed that this wasn't necessarily universal from law enforcement agency to law enforcement agency, whether or not NAMI provided that training. I guess a sort of a big question I have would be, you know, one, you know, is that training that's being provided at the academy, is that NAMI training, or is that something that the academy puts together? And then kind of number two, I know that we're looking at, you know, sort of law enforcement agencies, and, you know, 20%, you know, have to be certified within a certain department and everything in that. How do they pass that along? Or is it just kind of the hopes that when an officer shows up on scene and there might be somebody having some kind of a crisis, that, you know, you try to, you know, get an officer there with that kind of training? So I guess that's my question.
Yeah, so for starters, NAMI traditionally taught mental health first aid at the academy. That stopped for a while, and now has started again. And I'm proud to be partnering with NAMI at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy for those classes. They're also conducting 8 hours of mental health first aid for basic corrections as well. They're also required to receive that training. So crisis intervention team training itself, that's a NAMI contract. If you do a CIT in the state of Maine, it is through NAMI. And I've had great luck with them over the years. So that's the answer to that. As far as calls for service go, there are different approaches to that. If somebody calls dispatch as an example, there are some dispatch systems that actually have the officers designated as having, this is a CIT officer, so that they're going to respond to this type of call over another officer. There are systems where the dispatchers will assign somebody, and then the properly certified officer, if they have that skill set, will just volunteer to go. Some scenarios where a supervisor can control that and say, send so-and-so to that type call. So there's a bunch of different ways that's actually implemented real time on the road, but I wouldn't say that that's consistent from one system to the next. Did I get all those, sir? I think I got them.
Yes, that was great, Michael. Thank you.
All right, thanks, buddy.
Thank you. The next person is Representative Reckett. Representative Reckett? Move forward, and when she's available, she'll let us know.
I think we've got her.
Yeah,
just there? There we go.
Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this, because however I phrase it, it's going to be great somebody, starting with me, because I'm like every other white person right now who's struggling with these issues. At least I've got to a place where I understand my own racism. I don't understand it all, but I know I got it. I grew up with it. It's embedded. And I think that's true of, for me, I look at it as inherent racism, which I don't even think is a term of the day. But to me, my question is, do you, in your experience, are the issues that come up around racist behavior or behavior that results in a racist outcome, is that more prevalent in what I call veteran officers? That's not officers coming out of the military. I'm talking about longtime officers, the senior officers in police departments, the older guys or women. Do you think that those issues are more prevalent in that cadre of police officers rather than in those who have been trained in the last 5 years, let's say? I mean, is there an impact on of the training that has been happening? Is that making a difference that's showing up between the different levels of police in the state?
So I think that our current training model in hours has been in place for quite some time.
Right.
You know, so that has been in place. You know, I did a 12-week academy back in the 90s. In Waterville versus the 18-week when it went joint, which I think was 2001 to 18 weeks. So we've had that 720 in place. Some things have changed. The 720 hasn't changed, but some of that course load has changed. As an example, if you add 8 hours of mental health first aid in 2015, you've got to take something off. It's not that things got added on the back end. I think that the conversations within police departments and within the profession are much more profound and happen on a regular basis than they did years ago. And that doesn't matter whether you're a veteran officer or not. You're involved in those conversations within your departments. And I can say that having led those conversations and created those conversations, whether as a sergeant in a roll call room or as a chief of police, that those conversations are happening more now than they ever have before. And I do think, however, that you talk about brand new officers. So let's say I'm not even a police officer yet, but I've lived through 2020. I've lived through this latest version of the outrage, the frustration, the fear, the rage that individuals rightfully have given the circumstances that we're in. So I'm in high school and see this happen. I'm in college and I see this happen. Is that going to impact me and my career moving forward? Absolutely. And I would hope that it would. And I hope it would be and have a positive impact in the sense that you take that to heart. That's been part of your conversations when it wasn't when I was in high school, right? It just wasn't. We weren't talking about that at Mount Abram High School in Franklin County. But I think those conversations are had more now than they have in the past. And that's not to say that, an officer that's been around 10 years versus 2 years, again, those conversations are happening and they should happen more.
Thank you.
Next, I have Senator Bellows.
Thank you. So I have a related question. One, just to follow up on Representative Harnet's question, I understand that there are a lot of different technologies that law enforcement are using and that not every law enforcement agency in the state is using the same database or system. But from a programming perspective or from a technology perspective, just having boxes that you check in terms of basic demographic information feels fairly fundamental to what you can do with programs these days. So I guess one of the things that I don't understand, and I hear the millions of dollars, and to your credit, 10 million is a lot cheaper than our unemployment system, but we seem to have a problem with technology in that state agencies keep saying the technology is too expensive or we're locked into this contract and we can't do it. And yet in the nonprofit and private sectors, these changes can be made by, quite frankly, one person or one programmer with just a little bit of skill. Can you go a little bit deeper into the lack of ability to track demographic information? Because we're not going to get to the bottom of what's happening with profiling until we can start to correlate individual actions. And, when I go to your website, I can see the arrests by Trooper D for 620, right? Or stops rather. And I can see that very granular information about who was stopped, or, I can read in the newspaper, the police reports or the logs in some of the newspapers. And I just don't understand why we can't have some systemic demographic information collected as well.
So to me, I think there's two separate answers for that. One, on the technology side, and I'm probably the least qualified on the call to talk about technology, but I would say, however, that I would ask that same question, right? I mean, I would think that there's a lot of smart people out there that can make this stuff happen, but at a municipal level, at the state level, that's not the answer that I tend to run into over and over and over again around technology. And around vendors and around can we do this and how easy can we do it and how much is it going to cost? You got to be kidding me. How much was that? So those conversations, I run into that everywhere I go. When that 13 records management system, that language, that number was put out there, I think in 2009, when there was another anti-bias task force, which Representative Talbot Ross and probably, there you go, Senator, and others were involved with. It's probably the same one Tom was referring to as well, is that there was a conversation around data. And at that time, they found 13 different systems. They also found departments that weren't using computers at all still, right? Handwritten reports. And how are they cataloging data, and how are they pushing that into the system? That's not to say that it doesn't happen in other states, but there's going to be a price tag in order to do that. Maybe that's okay with us, but we just need to know that, going in. And then I think the next question is around how do you collect the information and without offending people that you're asking questions to. And then if we have police officers that are in fact collecting the data on a problem that we believe exists because of the police officer's implicit bias, would we go a year down the road and go, well, it's not really valid information. The police officers are essentially collecting it on themselves. And that was the other point, I think, in the conversation during the task force in 2009 and during 1475 in the last session that was brought up and openly discussed. And I'm happy to have that conversation and continue the conversation. And if somebody says the only answer here is that law enforcement must collect that and we're comfortable with what the outcomes are, then okay, let's talk about that. But apparently in those legislative sessions, it wasn't passed. So there wasn't enough the thought that was the answer, that was the approach that was going to be effective. I think I got both buckets, but maybe not.
Senator DeChambeau, are we allowed to do a follow-up at this point? Or are you asking us to wait?
Well, we're in the follow-up. I won't have you wait if it's on the same subject.
So Commissioner, you're absolutely right to put some of the responsibility on the legislature. You're absolutely right that we haven't acted. We didn't include data collection in the legislation that we passed, sponsored by Representative Hickman. And at the same time, there's been a tremendous amount of resistance for law enforcement. And of course, this is push-pull. We want to be collaborative and mutually supportive and make sure that reforms are embraced by those who implement them. And so I guess my question is, if we were to go back and revisit data collection and say, in your future RFPs for technology, you have to make the demographic boxes part of the RFP, and you have to, include this in your training for basic traffic stops. Is that something that you would object to at this point in time, given the national movement to get more data about what's happening at the community level? The incarceration data is super clear, but we also need some information about arrests and stops and that as well.
So the reason that the Department of Public Safety came in neither for nor against for 1475 is because I think we believe in the central concept, which is the data collection. Our issue was operationalizing what does that look like roadside, right? And by language in that statute, it talks about the officer's perception on not just race, gender, but religion and socioeconomic status. That's in the original language from that bill. And I can't for the life of me figure out how a police officer should do that effectively. My perception of somebody's religion or my perception of somebody's socioeconomic status, that just seems counterintuitive for anybody to make that decision roadside and check off a box. If that comes back down to we're interested in collecting racial data, and how can we do that? Then again, we're happy to be part of that conversation. Because if we talk to professionals and they say this is the best way to do that, and this is how we think we can do that effectively without offending everybody we talk to, which again would be counterintuitive, then we want to be on board with that. We want to be part of that conversation.
Thank you. I had my name next, so I'm going to follow up on that one. Commissioner, I'm going to direct your attention to the report that you read on law enforcement in Maine that was submitted or they put together about 3 weeks ago. Only on page 7 when you spoke about the accreditation program. I'm a stickler for standards. Standards means accountability. Your first sentence said over 4 years ago, the Chief of Police Association developed that accreditation program. with 162 standards. The following line says participating agencies. So that raised a question for me, is how many have subscribed to those basic standards? And I know it's only been 4 years. And part two of that, there are very few that have national accreditation. So could you give me numbers on first of all, how many police departments do we have in the state of Maine?
We have 165 agencies.
Okay.
12 of them actually have only part-time officers, but we do have 165 total.
Okay. And how many of those are subscribing to the Maine standards?
So and we'll go back to that first line. It says over the last 4 years,
yeah, the
association developed. So it took them a long time to develop the accreditation process. It's actually only gone live within the last 6 months or so. So you just throw COVID in there. What I'm aware of is that there's one agency that has fully been certified by the Maine version. And then there are a number of agencies that are lined up to get accredited through MLEAP. And I don't know the national certification, the CALIA certification process is a standalone entity. I really don't know the answer to that one. That's not a state of Maine style question that I'd be able to answer for you.
Okay, I guess my interest in that, they're the most progressive. There are maybe 6, 7, 8 of them, but they're the most progressive agencies. So thank you very much for that. The next person, I've got 3, and then there'll be more, I guess. Representative DeVoe, Representative Hickman, and Representative Morales. DeVoe?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner, would you consider 0.6% of the population in Maine to be a disappropriate number of people?
I'm sorry, so you cut out a little bit on the beginning. Is that, you said 0.6 or 1.6? I don't.
0.6.
0.6, do I think 0.6 is a disproportionate amount of?
In comparison to 94.5% white, would you consider 0.6% disproportionate?
I apologize if I'm dense. Disproportionate to what, sir?
In comparison to the 94.5% that's Caucasian.
It's a much smaller percentage. I don't know, disproportionate in that question. I apologize for I'm not grasping it, I guess.
I'm just trying to figure, because that's the percentage of Native Americans that are in Maine. It's actually less than half the number of African Americans in Maine. But yet we're trending all of this conversation today about one group. And my question is why aren't we looking at all groups and saying that there's issues within all?
I think from our perspective and a law enforcement perspective, we're not looking at one group versus another. We want everybody to be treated equally under the law. And there is certain data for certain groups over others that people have touched on today. But my thought process around that is that we should be focused on equality, period, and treating everybody equally across the system.
So do you think that there's systemic racism towards Native Americans in law?
I have no idea, sir. I don't know what the counter data would be for that. I haven't seen that breakdown, so I apologize.
What about the Jewish community?
Representative DeVoe, those questions are argumentative. It's just be clear in your question.
Why is it that you stop me from asking questions, but you haven't stopped others?
I have, and I think the others will agree to that.
Well,
please ask your question clearly and do not anger it. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I guess that pretty much answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Representative Hickman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I will start with just a brief comment, and then I'll ask some follow-up questions based on my initial question in this round. Commissioner, with all due respect, if a woman is wearing a hijab, it's probably true that she's a Muslim. If she's targeted for wearing that hijab by a police officer, then they are engaging in religious profiling, which could also be racial if that person happens to be a person of color. If you pull over someone on the side of the road and they've got a picture of Jesus on the dashboard, it's probably okay to assume they're Christian. Or if they've got a cross hanging in, it's their car. So I'm not exactly, or if you pull someone over for speeding and they're on their way to church and they tell you where they're going to church, then it's very clear to me what their religion would be. As far as socioeconomic status is concerned, I have heard several law enforcement officers say in different contexts, we go after the old beat up cars because that's where the drugs are, not the Lexuses and the Lincoln Continentals. The perception is poor people have drugs and rich people don't. And if you make an arrest or a stop based on that, then you're engaged in profiling. That's why those two things are included in that bill. Back to my original question. You believe that termination should be the end result of a police officer who regularly engages in profiling. And if one of his or her colleagues reports that to you, you might take that action. But I suspect you would also have to prove that the allegation is true. 1475 asks law enforcement officers simply to write down after every routine or investigative action the demographic and the outcome of the conversation or the interaction. I read in preparation for this meeting that law enforcement officers are currently not required to write anything down if they don't actually issue a citation to anyone in the course of doing their business. But often profiling does not end in a citation. So would you be opposed today to requiring that all interactions of law enforcement with people be documented in some way, shape, or form? Because that is the data collection that can tell us whether or not profiling is actually happening.
So to go back to the beginning there, I've got to say that I find it very interesting. If the thought process would be a police officer would pull over somebody and see a cross hanging from their rearview mirror, that they should just automatically infer that they're one religion, or they tell you, I'm late for church and what church am I going to? So therefore you must be a Baptist, and I'm gonna write that down on a piece of paper someplace to document what you look like, or what religion you are, or some socioeconomic status, that you're driving a Lexus, so a police officer should perceive what economic level you're at and document that someplace in the system is very interesting for me to hear that today. Somebody's wearing a hijab, so they're automatically going to think that they're a Muslim. It's very, very interesting that would be a take, that we're just naturally going to assume what people are one level or another. Oh, so you must be a Christian because you've got it's not my car. I just happen to have that. I've got a Jesus sticker on the back tailgate. Well, what does that mean exactly? To me, that's troubling. That's the thought process around data collection, would be that an officer would just use their perception to determine what they see on the roadside, and that we may use that information after the fact to say, well, this had to happen that way because the officer's perception was such in that box on that particular moment. So I just throw that out there to begin with. But the real question here is around data collection overall, and to prove allegations one way or the other. I've tried to be as clear as I can there, that I do believe data is power. I think it is important. It's also important that we collect it the right way, and that you're right, that there are agencies that don't document warning situations and other scenarios. I think that information would definitely be helpful. I say that, you're trying to make data-driven decisions without data. And that's not me saying that. That's half the task forces that were in place in the last session. So I agree with you there. What data, how much is too much data? Because that's separate conversations that I've been involved with in the past. as well. And I think we just need to make that determination and try to figure out what system is going to work to do that. Because there have been other states that in fact have done it. It's just we have to be committed to the level to make that happen. So
if I can be clear, presumptions are actually the reasons why some people take action against other people. I'm going to quote 2 short paragraphs from a very recent Juneteenth.
Wait a minute, Representative Hickman. I was wondering, I was looking at the agenda and I'm trying to follow this.
Yep.
And Attorney General Fry has been waiting since 9 o'clock. Right. And part of his presentation, along with Deadly Force review panel, is the collection and compilation of data on profiling as of LD 75. You may be very knowledgeable about that subject. I'm not. And that's why I wanted to wait to hear from the commissioner and the attorney general to speak, put us all on the same platform, and then we'll just pay attention on the questions regarding that. Is that all right with you? And you could make your comments then?
I'm perfectly willing to do what you asked, Madam Chair, but I was just focusing on the policing side of profiling, not the analysis side and the enforcement side and the complaint side, which the Attorney General's overview is. And so I would just ask for your preference.
Okay, is there a question in the 2 paragraphs you were going to present?
Yes,
or
there is.
Okay, I trust you.
There is a question.
Hickman, go ahead.
Thank you. Leaders in San Jose, California reached this conclusion 20 years ago when its police department began collecting racial profiling data. Quote, it seemed unimportant whether the officer had correctly guessed the race or ethnicity of the driver. What seemed important was to analyze whether, having perceived the driver as a person of color, the officer treated the person fairly. That's from a report. So if the perception of an officer about someone's socioeconomic status or religion means that they pull those people over more for routine traffic stops, would you then admit that that's a problem? On the policing side?
So you're talking about somebody's perception.
Yeah.
So essentially they're self-reporting against their own interests.
Correct.
That you're in fact going to take that data and say, well, that's golden because the officer self-reported that, and that's going to show an implicit bias or a disproportionate minority contact. Is that what the supposition is?
It might show a pattern, but it also might show how that person is treated after the fact. So if you have a law enforcement officer who has interactions throughout a day's work where they have perceived 80% of those interactions are with people of color and 20% are with non-people of color, and they are not actually in the community of a lot of people of color, would that seem to be a problem from your perspective? I'm not asking you to analyze the data. I'm asking you if you see that pattern, would that be a problem from your perspective?
So I think for me, patterns and trends are important, and that's a big piece of data. To be completely honest with you, I would prefer to stay away from hypotheticals about this is what happened and what do you think about that. I think patterns and trends are important. I think that's where data lies, is you can look at empirical evidence and say we had 12 of these and 2 of those. What does that in fact mean? I think that's what we're trying to get to. And I would agree that if you see patterns and trends, that they should be addressed properly. So I hope that adequately answers your question.
It doesn't, but we'll come back to it later. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you very much. Okay. Representative Morales.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to talk a little bit or ask you a little bit about our body cam and vehicular cam discussion that we had last session. And I think it resulted in more of a study. And I think in light of what we know now, you know, and many of you know, I worked as a trial court attorney for a number of years. And we know that the most compelling evidence in any case, civil or criminal, is a video of what happened. It could either protect, you know, the officer who acted appropriately or could protect the citizen from some sort of excessive force or inappropriate behavior, particularly for our Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks. And I think that, you know, we are seeing people in Maine marching in our streets in record numbers because there's no apparent accountability for police killings, for police brutality of our Black and Brown and Indigenous people. And, you know, I think it's really costly too, having served as a litigation attorney, to defend those lawsuits. So Commissioner, I just, you know, also considering the high bar of immunity, both state immunity and qualified immunity, it's really challenging to overcome those high bars to show that there was any misconduct. So when I think about, you know, the arguments against body cam, vehicular cam was the cost. You know, municipal taxpayers pay to defend their officers in all of these cases, whether it's a minor case of excessive force used on someone who was alleged to be loitering.
Could we have a question, Representative Morales, please?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm rambling. So I guess my question is, you know, first I want to know, did the Criminal Justice Academy talk about having a body cam, vehicular cam policy in place? And were there any discussions around that? And do you agree that if we had body cams in place, let's set aside the cost of it, that would be a way to provide accountability and be both helpful protection of law enforcement as well as protection of the public?
I don't know that, I'll have to check that. I don't believe body cameras are a minimum standard or a policy that's dealt with through the academy. And I'm getting the no on that, a solid answer there. You know, to me, cost is always a factor, but for cameras in general, we need to remember, to me, they're not the panacea for they're going to solve the world's problems. Remember, they're a police officer's wearing them, taping somebody else the vast majority of time. So the privacy concerns that are prevalent, and a lot of folks on this call today, very plugged in. Just look at the ACLU stance of body cameras, where it started and where it is now, and the studies that are out would show in many instances there's not a significant difference in the behavior of a law enforcement officer one way or the other. That's what many of those studies have shown. And some of those studies have shown that if departments are getting it right as it is, that's not going to really change the way they do business. And law enforcement and community members traditionally look at that as, well, the cameras are defending me against the other. Cops go, film me. People are filming me all day anyway. Vehicle cameras have been around since I started my career. So they're very, very, very prevalent. It's just the body camera obviously is inside people's homes, in hospitals, in all these different settings where you're going inside somebody's private sanctuary and you're videotaping them. To me, I would naturally think that that's going to have a positive impact on the way people react back and forth. But not all the studies have actually shown that. So when I say that body cameras are a very personal conversation, community to a community, that's the reason I say that, is because you need to get out and talk to the various constituencies about, so how is this going to impact you? And what do you think about us having body cameras in the city of, the town of, whatever that looks like? And then on top of that, you do have a cost around data collection. And there are large departments around the country that have entire discovery units now, because you're releasing so much data out to prosecutors and defending, defendants, that it's a lot of work that goes into that. Maybe that work's worth it, but it's definitely, to me, makes sense to have those conversations at that lower level.
Commissioner
was actually involved in that task force, and the Attorney General is funded Muskie to take a look at that stuff. But
yes, exactly, Commissioner. I am the sponsor of that body cam bill. And I thank the Attorney General for seeking funds to have a legitimate study by someone from the outside, the Muskie Institute, to look at. It is the Wild West out there now That's why I zeroed in on standards. There are police departments that don't have much of a policy written, but they give cameras to their sergeants. There are others that volunteer or work for another department and they have cameras with no policies. So we're getting around to that. So that's what we'll be aiming for. It's been mentioned 3 times today. I haven't said anything and I thought I'd say it now. So I don't think I have anybody else on there. So we will proceed to the next item. I did not read, so I guess this is the one that has presentation of the duties. Is that it? Yeah. Presentation of the duties and findings of deadly force review panel within the Maine Attorney General's office. And I think we can go right there if you wish, Attorney General Fry, about, might as well read it now, regarding collection, compilation of data on profiling. Thank you for being so patient.
Yes, no, thank you, Senator. And so understanding, we're going to start right with the Deadly Force Review Panel. I guess if I may just start with some just brief general comments that inform sort of how I'm approaching this discussion today. Less than a month ago, or at least over the course of the month, we've seen 3 Black individuals be killed at the hands of law enforcement, Floyd, Brooks, and Taylor. 2 when law enforcement were seeking to conduct an arrest, and 1 when there was a no-knock nighttime warrant. It was shocking. And these are questions that have been present for a long time about how people are policed, in particular, people of color. And so I think that those shocking events, even though they didn't happen in Maine, require us to have discussions now to ensure that we get to the root of the problem that we just all haven't been able to get to the root of, even though this has been happening for quite some time. Let me also add that in response to those killings, we've had a tremendous outpouring of individuals exercising their First Amendment right to bring voice to what happened and why systems need to change so that these types of practices don't happen again. And we saw a policing in some states and some municipalities that seem to be inconsistent with recognizing that people have a right to voice. So I provide this brief general comment because these are our present circumstances condensed in a short amount of time that certainly act to impress upon me the urgency of having conversations like this and trying to figure out how we change the systems so that we don't have these things happen again. And so with that being said, I mean, that really leads into to the extent that deadly force is used by law enforcement here in Maine. The Attorney General's office is the exclusive entity that investigates the use of this law enforcement use of deadly force for the purposes of determining whether or not that use of force was justified. Just stepping to the side a little bit, we're not the AG's office is not the only entity that looks at the use of deadly force. The law enforcement agency where the officer is housed is, as part of the policies that apply to law enforcement agencies, there is a review panel at the department level, at the agency level, that does not look at whether or not the shooting or the use of force was justified. It looks at whether or not policies were followed, whether or not there's any, if there was any, if policies are working, if they're not working, if the officer did not follow the policies or protocols that they should have. And those, it's my understanding that there's at least 4 members, it could be more, but there's at least 4 members of those agency review panels. They include somebody from the Maine State Police. They include a law enforcement officer from another department, a different agency. It includes a member of the public who has not and is not a member of law enforcement. And it includes a mental health professional Again, this is at the agency level. Those reviews do become, the outcomes of those reviews are publicly accessible. And so I mentioned that as an aside because that is an investigation that happens. It does not look at the justification for that use of force. Only the Attorney General's office looks at whether or not that use of force was justified by a law enforcement officer. Those investigations are led by the OAG. It's run by the investigations divisions here. Whenever there's a use of force, and to be clear, this isn't just if a law enforcement officer uses deadly force and a person is killed. This is the use of deadly force, period. So there are use of force investigations in which an individual against whom the force was directed did not die, either uninjured or injured. So I just want to be clear, this is about use of deadly force by law enforcement. There are times, so when that force happens, when that force is used, it's required by statute that the Attorney General's office be contacted so that we can get an investigator to the scene. Protocols are in place that ensure that the scene is frozen to allow an OAG investigator to get there to direct how the scene will be processed. There are times where it is difficult for one of the OAG investigators to get to a location in a short amount of time. So for example, if there was a use of deadly force incident in, say, Washington County or Aroostook County, we don't have any investigators that are based in close proximity to, so say if something happens up in Fort Kent, we do have resources that can help freeze the scene, law enforcement that we can contact to at least help freeze the scene to allow an investigator from the AG's office to show up. And then that the investigation, if you will, into whether or not the force was justified, it's investigated, and then the ultimate decision about whether or not a prosecution would be appropriate, if the use of force was justified, if something else has to happen, that would be by the Attorney General. That's a decision that falls there. As part of this, in the last session, there was a bill, 1219, that and Representative Evangelos, I believe, is in this meeting, so he'd be able to talk about the motivations more. But it was this question about whether or not there really was some sufficient state entity to provide oversight as to how this use of deadly force occurs. There was a study that was conducted. In fact, I believe Representative Corey was part of this study. And I'm just looking real quick. I'm not sure if anybody else on this in this meeting was a part of it. It looks like it was Senator Diamond was the other legislator. There was a 10-case review, sort of a very focused review, looking at 10 different closed cases of use of deadly force by law enforcement that was conducted. A report on that was delivered in January of 2019. It was a study that was initiated by then Attorney General Mills, and it concluded at the beginning of my term as Attorney General. And I think, I can't remember if a presentation of that report was given to both criminal justice and public safety and judiciary, or just one where the other was invited. But folks may remember that there was a sort of a test case, if you will, of having a collection of members from law enforcement, from the public, take a look at these cases to identify different aspects of what led to that use of force, to assess, what were the common characteristics, were policies followed, are there policies that are needed to improve upon, these situations where use of force was resorted to. Representative Corey would probably be in a much better position to talk about how that all came together. I will mention that at least one of the recommendations in particular that came from that, which was adopted, I've already mentioned today, and that is the mental health professional being attached to the agency review of the use of force. That was an idea that came from that initial just 10 case study that has already been put into effect. I don't think that was the only one, but I just mentioned that because it was a process that yielded results that that I think by and large were agreed to be beneficial. And so what resulted from 1219 was a panel that brings together 15 different individuals. 7 of those positions are law enforcement specific or directly law enforcement related. The other 8 are non-law enforcement officer positions. This is located in Title V, Section 200K. I'm just going to read the powers and duties because I think that this is important. The panel shall examine deaths or serious injuries resulting from the use of deadly force by law enforcement officer after the Attorney General has completed the investigation of the use of deadly force under Section 200A. The purpose of such examinations is to identify whether there was compliance with accepted and best practices under the particular circumstances and whether the practices were sufficient for the particular circumstances or whether the practices require adjustment or improvement. The panel shall recommend methods of improving standards, including changes to statutes, rules, training, policies, and procedures designed to ensure incorporation of best practices that demonstrate increased public safety and officer safety. So that was the charge that was given to this panel. Commissioner Sawchuk is the chair of that group. I did provide, although I'm not quite sure that I provided it in time to be disseminated, I did provide a membership list of all the individuals who were assigned. I think we pulled together a really good array of talents and backgrounds. In fact, a number of them were on that 10 case that I mentioned earlier. So Francine Stark of the Maine Coalition to End Domestic Violence, Deborah Bader, who is with the Maine State Forensic Service, Fern La Rochelle of Monmouth. These were individuals who already have a little bit of experience doing this kind of look into what I described as being looked into. And with the other folks that were tapped, I think we're going to be getting some good results. This it's an important conversation. Again, this has not happened in Maine before. This is not something that we see, at least not in this way. And I get this from talking with some of my other attorney general counterparts. This isn't something that we're seeing in this way codified to look at the use of deadly force by law enforcement. So it's very promising, and that I would offer in that respect. Let me also add that there have so far been 3 meetings of this panel. The first one occurred, I think it was in January. It might have been late December or early January. I did attend that one. Scheduling did not allow me to attend the other 2. There's one scheduled for tomorrow that I do plan to attend. It's my hope to actually attend as many of these as possible because these conversations are going to certainly inform me about how, either positives, negatives about the use of force and different policies that are not working and how they need to be changed, different statutes that need to be recommended, different reports that are going to be generated for legislative consideration and for my consideration. It has been decided that, at least as far as I understand, this is really going to be a decision for the panel to make. I don't know that there's any limitation on which cases can be reviewed other than the cases have to be closed. The 3 meetings that have occurred so far have really been more organizational in nature. And again, Commissioner Sawchuk would be in a better position to talk about those specifics. What I expect is going to happen tomorrow is just sort of a final organizational meeting about what materials are going to be needed so that in the meeting that happens, the panel meeting that happens after, we'll be doing that. Hey, we're looking at probably going to be a couple of cases. Again, it's up to the panel exactly how many they're going to look at. so that we can be having some data, some reporting out in plenty of time for consideration come later this year and into the next session. I guess let me stop there. Probably questions are going to be more helpful in fleshing out this panel and my thoughts on it and its potential and concerns about it. So perhaps this is a good opportunity to open up, to ask if there's any questions about the panel.
Thank you. That was very informative. Thanks. I think we will open it up for the one question, then followed by follow-up. And I have Representative Corey. Representative Corey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'd like Aaron had
Aaron's fine.
Attorney General Frey had said, sorry, it's to do with serving with you in the legislature, had said, I'd served on that task force. And I think that sort of one big thing that sort of came out of looking at those 10 different cases, I think that they actually gave us like one or two afterwards. And for nobody that's ever sort of read these cases before, it's pretty amazing to see sort of what kind of, deference, law enforcement, gives to not making sort of rash decisions in these circumstances, how sort of very sort of prolonged and everything, things are drawn out, for as long as they can be drawn out before, decisions are being made, unless something is just happening all of a sudden. One thing that I found sort of most interesting sitting on that panel was that, in spite of having sort of investigators, looking just specifically at these types of cases, how differently the reports that are written are, it seems like, everybody's, got their own sort of reporting format, and you have to kind of, delve out the details from those in order to, kind of make any uniform report. Luckily, we had a really good chair on that task force that after that group came together, really sat down and compared every report and said, in this circumstance, this happened, and so, we had a list of criteria that, we agreed on and looked at, and then we were able to kind of, compare apples as much as apples could be compared. I think that sort of my question really around this is kind of centered on, our ability to learn from these different incidents that take place, and how much that kind of data is going to be available. I know that at the end of that report, we ended up with three sort of big areas. One would be that, that people had recently had a loss, in their life, that could have been, a significant other, like leaving them, or, a number of other things. One was, definitely substance use. I think that the alcohol levels in some of these people were insanely high. It was like 0.24% was the average. And then I think the three was that, that they had at one point, been involved in the mental health system. So I guess what I'm curious about is that, yes, we'll be looking at, with this other thing that's going on right now, each one of these incidents, but is that information that comes out of that then going to be sort of aggregated, do you know what I mean, into something useful for policy makers going forward? Not necessarily that it would be identifying, but just, aggregated in a way that we would actually kind of be able to see, what kind of impacts we're making in those areas. Thank you, Aaron.
Yes, no, thank you, Representative.
General Frank.
No, Aaron is fine. Thank you. So just a couple of different points of information in answer to that. So first of all, you're absolutely correct. I mean, the benefit of having this examination is being able to have different data filtered through a number of different perspectives on the panel. And then, as was the case with the report that the group that you worked on, Representative, had put out, it synthesizes that with some recommendations so that you have a document that has both the analysis done, the information in it, and the recommendations that come from it. And it is expected that or in fact, I think it's part of the statute, although of course I can't find the specific sentence in the statute, the reports of the examinations by the panel are going to be provided for the legislature to consider. So there is going to be that source, if you will, that looks at the particulars of a case, and that's just one piece of information. So this any report from the panel is going to be able to be read in conjunction with the Attorney General's findings, right? So that's a separate document that will be available to take a look at that has data synthesized in it. There is the review by the agency that is also accessible in public information to see what sort of assessment they made. And even though some of the data that was relied upon might not be able to be communicated, and I think you touched on this. So with respect to the review panel, there's a confidentiality, there's an access to information, confidentiality. It was built much in the same way as the domestic violence homicide review panel, in that we want to make sure this panel has access to information that might be otherwise protected by statute, so that there is a full examination that can be made without having to worry about, sorry, you can't look at that because it's medical data, or you can't look at that because that's a law enforcement report. While that information that's relied upon might not be able to be explicitly provided, right? Like it's still protected information. We do have both law enforcement officers and non-law enforcement officers on this panel who can look at that information and still make recommendations and their own findings based on that. So I hope that was responsive. It's really meant to get to the point of, and actually I'm looking here. I now found it. This is paragraph 7 of the panel statute. Within 30 days of the conclusion of the examination by this panel, they are to submit a report on the panel's activities with conclusions and recommendations. So this will be just one, an important, but just one of pieces of data that the legislature, the AG's office, law enforcement agencies, advocacy agencies can rely upon when examining the conduct of an agency when the use of deadly force was used.
Thank you, sir.
Next is Senator Bellows.
Thank you. And you heard me ask this question of Commissioner Sostek, but I think it's an important question that just needs to be top of mind for everyone who's in a position of authority and responsibility. And that is when you are making your own appointments to the Deadly Force Review Panel. Were you thinking about representation? What are you doing as you're thinking about this moving forward to look at issues of bias? And I'll just stop there.
So first of all, let me acknowledge that, yes, that is, first off, an important consideration, a necessary consideration. Let me also confirm that was at the top of my mind when these different appointments were made. What did become challenging, so two parts of this. First of all, it did try to work in at least some balance with gender, did have trouble identifying other, whether it be race, sexual orientation, ethnicity. It was harder to identify panel members there. Hopefully I'm representing correctly that I did reach out to Representative Talbot Ross in her connection with NAACP to specifically have a conversation relating to the individual who's a representative of a statewide civil rights organization whose primary mission is related to racial justice appointed by the Attorney General. Did talk about who we might be able to identify that not only encapsulates that position, but would also demonstrate a commitment to ensuring we're getting all kinds of different perspectives from a number of different angles. I can't say that we batted 1,000 on this round. I do think it was at the top of my mind, and frankly, as positions come up for reappointment, we're going to have to. I expect there's going to be some reconsideration of how we might show a better diversity of viewpoint based on backgrounds. I hope that's responsive to your question, and I hope it also recognizes that there was some effort to factor in those considerations. But just looking at who ended up getting named, that would not be evident just by looking at those, at the people appointed.
Thank you. Next is Representative Evangelos.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon, Mr. Attorney General.
Good afternoon.
The LD 1219 was a compromise bill, and it was a good start. If I had known then what I know now with the more recent events, I would have pushed harder and fought harder for more transparency and independence. But I'm encouraged by a couple of your remarks today that that's something you're going to be open to. Obviously, we're seeing rapid fire reforms around the country with these recent events. For instance, in Atlanta, almost the immediate release of police body cam footage. And those are the kind of reforms I want you to continue to work on and bring forward, if possible, on a unilateral basis. You are invested with certain powers. You don't have to wait for us. It's not likely we're going to be entertaining or introducing reforms until next January because of the legislative schedule and the difficulties we're having getting back in Augusta and the workload we've left behind. But some of these things are pressing, and certainly the public release of critical information not only is good for the public's faith in law enforcement, but it's good for the good law enforcement people that are out there when we see that transparency and independence of an investigation, that only works to build people's confidence in law enforcement. So I think in Maine, the investigations of deadly force, use of deadly force, do need more independence. Maine's a small state, and you have a small office in that regard, and the same people continually investigate these things and continue to come to the same conclusions. And when we look back on some of these cases, we find that there was other evidence. I don't need to get specific today, you know what I'm talking about. And there are some other pending cases. There's the case in Minot, where we're waiting on. It was a wellness check that it resulted. A family called the police for a wellness check, and a few hours later, the man's got 8 bullets in the body. That's not an acceptable outcome. We have the case in Dixmont where there was a de-escalation team from New Hampshire just minutes away. The state police knew they were on the way, but they had to use their robotic explosive device and blow the guy's house up. It's an old man, and as he stumbled out of the house, he was shot. And I guess those 2 cases are still under review by your office?
That's correct, yes.
So I guess, and I didn't know if, with the precedents being set, with some of the other work we're doing together, whether some of these other cases in the past where the person who was shot was unarmed are going to get a second look. I'm not arguing with you that the majority of these cases were unjustified. Certainly the police have a rough job. I'm not going to make that argument. But I think there are some cases that are problematic. And I know there was a case involving a woman in a camp who was shot through a window. She was holding her rifle, but she wasn't aiming at anybody. That was ruled justified. So I think we need to learn the lessons of what's going on in these other states and the immediacy of these reforms that are possible without legislation. It's something a mayor, a governor, an attorney general, or a police chief can do on the ground. So My question is, will you please consider making these additional reforms in the interest of transparency and independence?
Yes, so thank you, Representative. The answer is yes. And just to, I think, touch upon the points that you were raising, I do understand that the 1219 didn't go as far as had been initially intended, that there may be an interest to expand on that. I think that this is a good start, and I'm not going to argue that this is where we should stop. I think it just moves us in the right direction on being able to provide more eyes on the case. As I indicated with the 10-case review that occurred, some very good information and some good recommendations came from that. And so I just see that as moving us in the right direction. And, I mentioned earlier that in talking with some of my colleagues, my attorney general colleagues around the United States, at least we are better positioned to be having these, asking these tough questions, having these hard conversations, because we've been able to take some actions before now. So for example, the independent review panel, or the deadly use of force panel, that came in last year, and it wasn't because we saw what we saw happen someplace else. I look at these things as a start. I don't look at them as solving the problem. What I do look at it as is it moves us in a direction where we can get to these systematic changes that are necessary to ensure that, to ensure that we have more confidence in policing, more confidence that people are being treated appropriately, fairly, without bias or prejudice. And there are cases under review. Information will be public as soon as the review is completed. And I appreciate that that questions are going to come up about whether or not justification decisions were appropriate in the past before I became Attorney General. I think I've demonstrated a willingness to take a look at that. But I guess I might stop there before I make too big of an invitation to look back over 20, 30 years of cases. Let me also add that in terms of my own process, because I didn't mention this earlier, at least so far, I have personally wanted to review the entire file before I make the decision that I'm invested by statute to make. Because for something as serious as the use of force by law enforcement, my name's on that, or my name's underneath the finding. And so I've been taking that decision very seriously. And I offer that because I don't think I had mentioned that before to either committee, that for me, I personally look at the entire file, or at least I have been looking at the entire file.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the question and answer period. If there are any left, other than that, we have been at this almost 6 hours, I guess a little over 5 hours. Does anybody else wish to make, to direct a question to either Attorney General Fry or Commissioner Sawchuk before we close?
Wait, just so to be clear, I haven't talked about the profiling.
I'm sorry. Did I miss that? Yes.
I just want to close on.
I am completely sorry for that. It's been touched upon back and forth, and I missed that. Yes, please make your presentation known. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. People who've worked with me know that that's sort of hard for me to do. I do appreciate the time, but this is very important. And so LD 1475, as has been mentioned earlier, proposed a number of different things. As it was indicated earlier by Representative Hickman, the bill did, not only did it make the act of profiling an actionable offense. That is to say, a complaint could be brought. It defined the prohibition of profiling. It gave the ability for an individual to seek redress if they were subjected to that impermissible profiling, either on their own or through the Attorney General's office. And it did involve the collection and analysis of data. I mean, it very basically. And what came out of that, what came out of 1475 was really focused at the Attorney General's office, making an examination of, for lack of more complex explanation, reaching out to organizations across the state who have information about what exists for information relating to profiling, either from a law enforcement side or from the side of a person who may have been subjected to profiling, and to provide a report back on sort of what the lay of the land was here in Maine, and some ideas about how we might be able to improve or move forward to get to the bottom of to ensure that we're getting the information we need to make it informed policy decisions. And by the way, this is all with the backdrop of the understanding, and this goes to questions that were asked earlier, with the understanding that these systems are acting in ways that are disparate to minority backgrounds, Black, Hispanic, different ethnicities, and how it is we are able to ferret out where these problems are. You might have a facially neutral policy, but if nobody's looking at how that policy is being implemented, that's a problem. And so what it is, so I believe everybody here, I know the Judiciary Committee would have received directly the March 16th letter from me with attachments. I believe that this was made available. I think there's a link to it, probably either on the Judiciary Committee page or maybe the Criminal Justice and Public Safety page at this point. And just the key points that I want to highlight are, and we've heard some of this earlier. Records management is determined at the law enforcement agency level. It's not directed in any universal way that everybody needs to have the same system. The estimate was 13 different systems, as Representative Harnett mentioned earlier, and I believe Representative Talbot Ross was also on that group. I'm not sure if others in this briefing were part of that group, but that 13 different systems actually comes from data that goes back that far. So in other words, there really doesn't seem to have been a lot of conversation since that time, and I think Representative Harnett highlighted this when he spoke earlier, to address the differences in systems and how they're used. The information that's collected is based on if a complaint or if a citation is issued, right? So it's not if a roadside encounter or a stop and chat, as they're called, right, where a citizen is approached by law enforcement on the sidewalk and, hey, can I talk to you about something? That information is not being collected. It's only information that if a person is stopped in a motor vehicle, or if a citizen is stopped, as they're leaving a store because of some complaint and they're issued a citation, it's at that point where a limited data set would be collected. So there's limited data from that angle, right? There's also, frankly, limited information that, at least for me, and I'll speak to from my perspective. Others can share this or not, but it's limited confidence as to whether or not we have the data we need to show that our systems are working, right? I mean, I'm looking at this with a presumption of the system's not working, particularly when it comes to profiling that may be engaged in policing. How can we show that it's not, right? And at least in terms of what it is that we were able to uncover here at the office, one of the primary deficiencies was that the data we're collecting wouldn't allow us to reverse that presumption. We did outreach. I believe that the report outlined that we had reached out to the Immigrant Legal Advocacy Project, the Maine People's Alliance, the Maine Chiefs of Police Association, the Maine Sheriff's Association, the 8 district attorneys' offices, Cumberland Legal Aid Clinic, Maine Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, ACLU of Maine, the Maine Department of Public Safety, the Maine State Police, and the NAACP. We included all of the responses that we received. Those are the attachments, or they'd be found in the attachments with the material. So for example, the ACLU provided some material relating to data collection programs in California and Connecticut in particular. And so we provided that. What we learned from the Maine Human Rights Commission, for example, is that over a 20-year period, there were 48 cases filed where an individual made an allegation that their civil rights were violated by a law enforcement officer in the course of conduct that led to an interaction. And out of those 48, none of them resulted in any sort of determination that, with the Human Rights Commission finding that those allegations were appropriate. So don't know what happened from there. There was one pending criminal motion. I believe it was in Cumberland County, might have been Androscoggin, but I think it was Cumberland. There was a motion to suppress that was included in this material that would show you where it is. And that motion to suppress was based on evidence that troopers were engaging in tactics that involved discrimination based on race. Yesterday, I checked it, at the time of my writing of this letter, we did not know what the outcome of that was. We checked yesterday and we still don't have an answer from the court. Apparently the court wanted to take some more evidence and that just hasn't happened yet. So I don't have an answer there. There was one federal case that we had found that talked about a law enforcement officer violating an individual's constitutional rights. And that federal case didn't, I think it had gone to the First Circuit and there was not a finding that an individual's constitutional rights were violated. We did have confirmation of that there are communities that are targeted, allegations of targeting by law enforcement, that profiling is occurring. So we have that coming from the communities. I want to sort of step to the side here for a second to just highlight what I think is another finding from this. And this came up in the Judiciary Committee. I can't remember now if it was January or February. It's when I had come in to talk about our program evaluation. Something that Representative Harnett and maybe Senator Bellows, but I can remember Representative Harnett had brought up is, there is a paramount importance of outreach to affected, targeted communities, because the only way that you're going to get the information that you really need, or so that you can develop the trust that's needed to make sure that the complaints are coming in. You can have a complaint policy here at the Office of the Attorney General all day long. If nobody trusts that the OAG or trusts that the Maine Human Rights Commission or trusts that the law enforcement agency is going to treat those complaints with the respect that they deserve, you're closing the door before it's even opened. And the only way that you can build that trust is to go out into the communities. I did not highlight that in the letter. In the letter, what was highlighted is that when it comes to because this office does have presently an informal policy where complaints of profiling by law enforcement can be made. There's only talk about outreach to law enforcement agencies to make sure that any complaints are being forwarded to us. I guess I want to add that the outreach also needs to be directly to the communities where the complaints would come from. and I recognize that I am not as far along as I'd like to be on making that a reality. But it is, particularly as an outcome of this particular look, it was apparent to me that if you don't have the trust, we're not going to get the information that we need to take the actions that we need to take to reduce and to work towards less profiling. So those were the key. That was sort of the key information that developed. There were. Let me also add, there were the two states that we did spend some time looking at with some significance was California and Connecticut, and information specific to California was included with the submission from us. It came from the ACLU. We had also in the office, my chief deputy had she worked on this. She had reached out to Connecticut to talk with them about their program. It provides for data points that are collected roadside. So there's and this goes to the three recommendations that I made in the letter. California and Connecticut, we have examples, and maybe in Oregon and Rhode Island as well. Although I didn't prepare to talk about Rhode Island and Oregon, but certainly with California and Connecticut, we have examples of states who have gone through the work of establishing systems where they are able to collect the information that we need or that would be helpful in determining whether or not there's a pattern and practice that equates to impermissible profiling, that would allow us to better understand, where exactly the fixes need to be made. And the assessment was that it does not take very long roadside to collect up these perceptions. And some of the information that's collected, by the way, is information that's going to be standard for every stop. So officer, who the officer is, duration of the stop. It's just some of these things are going to be very easy, uniform, because it's really only in this way that we're going to get the transparency we need, and that we're going to get information that we can rely upon to increase the confidence that we need to increase that the systems can work. So as I mentioned, there were three options that were presented. One is we do need to or we recommend that the legislature consider creating a system of data collection that may be similar to what's happening in states like Connecticut and California. Of course, we would be a part of that conversation. We can help get information from attorneys general's offices in those states about how it's working, just as I'm sure Commissioner Sawchuk would be able to access his counterparts to talk about how they're working there. There may be some federal funding that's available to help with startup and maintenance. And the cost, it had a certain cost in, say, Connecticut and California, but that cost might not be the same for Maine as it's a smaller state. Let me also add that in terms of other system, and I probably should have mentioned this before I got to the options, but there are two other systems that I know I'm paying attention to that might help us with showing what's happening and being able to have answers or better answers, maybe for lack of a better way to say it, as to what's happening in our criminal justice system with how people are being charged, what they're being charged for, what sentences they're getting. There is a new system that is being developed by district attorneys' offices. So there's been an ongoing multi-year process to get all of the DAs and the AG's office in a uniform reporting system. And so it's my understanding that is a system that will help provide information that we can use to understand how I'll call it the criminal, it's not the criminal justice side, how once you're charged, once the complaint is hitting the system, how are offices dealing with those cases, and are there different practices that, you know, are problematic? Additionally, we all know that the court system is undergoing a significant overhaul of its electronic data management systems. And I'm expecting that we're going to be able to get more information from that as well. That will be important for, you know, conviction, sentencing information. You know, when you look at a complaint, there's information about race and age and gender. So that would those are also systems that we can access that are coming online that will be very helpful at getting to the root of these problems that we know exist but have not yet been able to solve. The other two options that were so the first option, of course, was, you know, let's implement a system consistent with what some other states have done that allow us to do what frankly was talked about back in it was 2012 was that last report that Representative Harnett and Representative Talbot Ross were associated with. I mean, these are problems that were recognized then, and this is something that we can do now. The other two options, one was to formalize a process that the Attorney General's office already had. So I mentioned earlier that we had the informal process of receiving complaints that profiling was occurring. I've already directed that be completed, and I have that drafted ready for me to sign off on. I just hadn't signed off on it yet, but that's going to happen imminently. So that option will already be done and completed here soon. Secondly, and then the other option under C relates to recommendations as to what might happen through the Criminal Justice Academy. And as we heard earlier, progress was made on that option already on Friday. We need to be vigilant, and I'm saying this for me, I'm asking this of law enforcement agencies. And I'm asking this for you know, those in communities that can help me do my job. You know, this just means we have to be vigilant with the data that we're getting in the outreach to targeted communities to generate the complaints that we need to take action. That's just that's not one of the options, but I think that that's implicit in what it is that I submitted. That, you know, there's work to be done to make sure that you know, we're getting the complaints that we need to take action. So that's I think the presentation that covers that letter. And again, questions are always a great way to point out what I missed.
We can all appreciate that no question is simple to answer. Very involved. Did a fantastic job. Thank you very much. And the 8-page report you gave us has all that information also. So thank you. Anybody? I do see. Senator Bellows, followed by Representative Hickman, have questions.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Attorney General. One of the things that I found most astonishing about your report back to us was that there has only been one complaint of racial profiling to your office since 1993. So we're talking 27 years and only one complaint, which was not substantiated. And so my question is two-part, because, you know, to your credit, you reached out to organizations that are in touch with these communities, and ILAP and the ACLU did share with you reports from some of their constituencies about racial profiling. But those organizations aren't experts in data collection. And the other interesting attachment to your report was the indication from Maine State Police that at the very least, they can track gender and race with regards to traffic stops. So my question is, why do you think you've only received one complaint? Why do you think your office, I mean, there was a sentence in the report that maybe it was due to state and local law enforcement not engaged in profiling, but again, one complaint in 27 years in contrast to multiple enumerated instances from ILAP and ACLU is concerning. And then my question is, are you ready to support mandatory data collection on gender and race as a starting point?
So let me start with the second part of your question first. Yes, I am prepared to support that and do what I can to be a part of that, because I do expect, much in the same way that that I'm setting up through what I'm formalizing consistent with option B, is that I'm expecting that this office would receive the information and then process it, looking at those data points, at those identities. I don't have a good answer. I don't have an excuse that I can offer that I've been able to identify. I mean, I've only been on the job for what, 18, 19 months now. I don't know why. We've only seen in 20 years one complaint to the OAG, because it isn't for a lack of a it's informal, but it wasn't for lack of a policy. It just wasn't coming in. It's not because there's a lack of education for law enforcement. I can't remember if Commissioner Sawchuk touched on this, but there's basic civil rights training for officers in the Criminal Justice Academy training. But then each law enforcement agency is by policy supposed to have a civil rights officer who's supposed to be attentive to whether or not these complaints should be made. And so I can't, one of the things that I started off with, and I can't remember if it was as part of this discussion or as part of the deadly use of force panel, I'm coming at this with the presumption that there's a problem and that a lot of work needs to happen to prove that it's not a problem or that it's not a problem anymore. And one report to the 08 to the Office of the Attorney General, only 48 with no recommendations of a problem from Maine Human Rights Commission, right? That's a problem. Not having any information about how this is being addressed in the criminal justice system. So either from Maine criminal defense attorneys or from prosecutors who, from the district attorney's office who said, oh yeah, no, we had this fight over, or we had this motion over whether or not, race or gender or a protected class, or not protected, but, just an identity that was targeted inappropriately. I don't know why that information is not there. I just don't understand why there are not these complaints. And so, as I mentioned, and again, I give credit to Representative Harnett, and I think you were part of this push as well. Yeah, it's like, something that, and I can really only speak from my perspective, from my office since I've been AG, something that we have not done yet that I wanted to do was to have that very candid, trust-based relationship with different organizations, like ILAP, like, I think I have a fair enough relationship with the ACLU, but we haven't had specific conversations about, what, different profiling that may be occurring that has generated a complaint. Those relationships need to be augmented and better developed so that, we'll call it shaking the tree. I mean, just to get, they are there, right? And I don't know why I don't have a good answer for you as to why we don't have those complaints.
Yeah, and just to clarify, I wasn't on the task force. Alicia Melnick represented the ACLU, but I was there with Representative Talbot Ross and then Assistant Attorney General Tom Harnett, and in the creation of that task force. And at the time we were told, let's study the issue before we implement mandatory data collection. And that was over a decade ago. And unfortunately, we continue to study without taking the action to try to get at the root causes. And now, young people all over Maine are asking us, why aren't you acting? So thank you for your willingness to engage with us to try to move toward mandatory data collection. I think it's really important.
And I'm sorry that I missed you on the 2012 study.
Next, it would be Representative Hickman, followed by Representative Talbot Ross.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Attorney General Frye, for your willingness to support this bill in a previous version that was more robust and, quite frankly, allowed for a person who is injured by profiling to seek some relief. If I may, Madam Chair, I just want to maybe answer a question that has been asked by Senator Bellows about why there may not be a lot of complaints reported. And then I will ask the Attorney General a specific question. I think fear is the answer. People are not just marching in the streets because of police killings. People are also marching in the streets because they don't believe that law enforcement officers will ever be held accountable for their abuses of power. I've been brutalized and I have been profiled. And I can actually say that the lingering effects of profiling are every day. And so people feel terrorized by the fact that they might have their freedom infringed upon simply because of who they are or what they're wearing or what they're driving. And it is safe to say, from my perspective, since I've been profiled a lot, I don't complain about it because I don't think anything is going to happen. There's also a sense of survival, which is when you get through the profiling experience, you don't want to look back at it. So you don't want to necessarily tell anybody that it happened. That might include your loved one, your spouse. So it's going to be hard to file a complaint in a system where you're not sure if the complaint itself will make you a target of more aggressive policing in the future because your name is attached to the complaint. I don't think I can speak for everyone who's been profiled, but I know those are the reasons why I have never filed a complaint in all of the times that I've been profiled in Wisconsin and Massachusetts and Maine. And so my question to you is I'm glad you addressed the part of the final law that asked you to formalize the complaint process. And you mentioned earlier, Attorney General, that outreach to targeted communities to build trust that their complaints will be heard and taken seriously is important. And so I'm wondering if in what you have not signed off on, you have a robust outreach component as a part of that formalized complaint process. Because if people do not feel comfortable, safe, coming forward in a confidential manner to report incidences of profiling, then I'm wondering if that will ever be the case where you can actually see it without the data collection, because this is irrespective of data collection. So do you have that robust community outreach in your final formalized rulemaking process?
I'm looking, so thank you. Let me also add that Representative Hickman, I appreciated your remarks. You had sent along to me some remarks that you had made very recently here in Augusta, and I appreciated you sending those along. And I've appreciated before when you've shared with me some of the challenges that you've had that you referenced today with law enforcement. I think you're right about fear, which was why that that building a relationship with the affected communities is most important, so that they can look me in the eye, look somebody from the office in the eye, and know that we are treating this with the sensitivity that it deserves. I am taking a quick look at because I don't remember. I do not see that there is an outreach component of the protocol relating to profiling complaints. So let me take this back. It won't take very long to be taking it back. And maybe it's just as well that I haven't signed off on this yet, because it might be that I can improve it before it moves forward. And let me also add that, I do think that this renewed look at 1475 and what was not achieved in the passage of that bill, it's probably appropriate to be taking another look at that just as soon as the legislature is able to. And I want to be a part of that conversation. So I just want to express that to you and to the committees.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I do have a follow-up, but I'll wait until we go through the first round.
Thank you, Representative Hickman and Attorney General. The next person is Representative Talbott Ross.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Attorney General Frey. I'll be very quick. And I'm not quite sure if the question is directed to you or to Commissioner Shostak. But one of the findings out of the 2012 report was for adoption of model policy on racial profiling. And I do know that the Maine Criminal Justice Academy did adopt a model policy. But my question is how many law enforcement agencies in the state have actually implemented such a policy?
So I would have to defer to the commissioner on that if there's going to be an answer today, because I don't know the answer off the top of my head. I can get that. I just don't know that I'll be able to get it before we get done with this. Because if the policy was adopted, I would think the answer should be every single agency should have that in place, right? Because as I understand the flow, if the Criminal Justice Academy sets forth standards, it's required, I think, by statute that law enforcement agencies adopt those standards as part of their policy. So, but I don't want to dip my toes in waters where I'm going to give the wrong information. If Commissioner Shostak's right there, he might be able to provide.
And my follow-up question is, if every law enforcement agency is supposed to have a model policy, then they must have a way of collecting the complaints and the data. I mean, why have a policy if you can't actually enforce it? So I don't know if that is a question to Commissioner Shostak, but we did adopt that. That was one of the, good things that came out of a 3-year process. And so I'd like to know what the status is of it. Likewise, you had brought up that every law enforcement agency in the state is supposed to have a civil rights officer, but you can go to a half dozen law enforcement agencies online and no one is named as that person. So if we're trying to get to a place where the community trusts law enforcement, the community believes that they can come forth with complaints, the community believes that it can engage at any level of law enforcement, and we can't even find annual reports online, we can't find out who the civil rights officer is, there's no complaint process that you can access, there's no model policy that you can turn to, that the Criminal Justice Academy only has 2 hours worth of elective racial profiling training, and that's separate from civil rights training, which is separate from the history of law enforcement training. I mean, there's no intersectionality around any of this. We don't know what the credentials of people who are actually teaching at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy are. We don't know if the Maine Criminal Justice Academy Board of Trustees, if they go through any training. There's only 4 women on that board out of 17 people, only 5 civilians. I mean, this is not an isolated discussion. And it does not seem like we have addressed this throughout the entire system of policing. And then we ask ourselves, why is there only 1 complaint in 20 years? Well, I think we got the answer. I think we have the answer. But the question now is do we have the courage to put in place what we say we're going to do and allow for the public to be able to come forth and trust that their complaints are going to be taken seriously, and that it won't happen again, that there's some enforcement of the laws we keep passing. We pass a lot of laws. We don't follow a lot. So maybe it's a question for Commissioner Shostak.
Yeah, sure. So the hate or bias crime policy is a minimum standard. So all law enforcement agencies in the state of Maine are required to comply with that, and required to have that certified that they've done that annually. And they all also require to have civil rights officers. I don't, however, know that they're required to have it on their website. They should.
Sorry.
That's okay. I got you. So, that has happened at the academy level, and that's the next level of accounting, is that annual certification. I'll fully say that the academy does not go out and do road trips or site visits to confirm or dig into that next level. They have 11 staff members at the academy right now, and they do not do the follow-up at that particular level. So that's a piece of what you asked, Rachel, and then there was some broader questions there for sure.
Yeah, we can follow up later. I just don't know how we expect the public to come forward if not even online, you know who the civil rights officer is for the department. I mean, there's no complaint form online. There's no policy online. How are we, and there's no outreach. And then the public does not have much, there's not that many seats on all of these oversight boards. How do we really think that the public is supposed to trust law enforcement to do their duty around public safety, particularly the Black, Indigenous people of color who are obviously they're disproportionate throughout the entire system? I don't know why we're asking these questions still. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to the process or anybody in it. We've invested a lot of time here today, but these seems like really obvious questions that we should have some answers to by now.
Thank you, Representative
Thank
Talbot.
you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, Representative Hanna.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Attorney General and Commissioner again. And I hope I have a question, but I really want to, I think after Representative Talbot Ross's last comments, I just want to build on those. Policies are important. Policies that the public knows nothing about are meaningless to the public. Outreach is critical. If the only time affected communities are dealing with law enforcement are negative encounters, you're never going to have a positive relationship. Outreach is also something that is not one visit. It's not coming out after something horrible has happened. It is establishing relationships that are longstanding so that folks in affected communities can say when something happens to them that they might think was racial profiling or unfair hostility directed at them by law enforcement, they can say, oh, I remember that guy or that woman who came and talked from the Attorney General's office about this or from the local police department. I can go talk to them because I know them and I know they care about it. So I don't think we can overstate the importance of making sure the policies are known, not just to the department. And Commissioner, I believe you said on Main Calling the other day that there are times when even the law enforcement personnel don't know about all the policies because there are lots of them. And, you know, they're buried in some large book somewhere. And that's not an insult to those departments, but it's a reality. So I guess my question is, wouldn't you both agree?
Emphatically.
Yeah, I think that really for us in the law enforcement side, trust and relationships is the cornerstone of what we do. And when we lose that trust, which we've seen for some of these departments for sure, and as a profession, that's why we end up in difficult situations. I spent a career building relationships with folks. I've had those phone calls to my desk directly to say, hey, Mike, this happened. What should I do? And the answer is always, you should file a report. You should call us. Let me send somebody to your house and walk through what happened so we can, in fact, investigate these circumstances when they come up. I don't think there's any question about that. And I think that for me, I would agree. When I see categories like, you know, in an annual report, they say, well, domestic violence went down. My head goes to, well, I think that we're not getting the reports of this actually occurring. So when I see a 0 or a 1 in any of these categories, you do have to go, do we have the trust in our communities where people are willing to come forward and report? I think that that's accurate. I understand that. Community policing and relationship building is nonstop. It needs to be. It shouldn't only occur when the bad thing happens. It's for me, when I look around the country and I see some of previous scenarios that have popped up, previous tragedies that have popped up around law enforcement, and then I see the follow-up is always, well, we're going to have meetings to build relationships. And the honest answer there is that if that's your response to an emergency, then you're already too late. It's never too late to start, but if you had those relationships, maybe it wouldn't have occurred to begin with. And I say that with the knowledge that we are far from perfect, and we need to continue to strive and to work on these issues. So I don't disagree with anything that I just heard.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Next is Representative Hickman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to just follow up on two things. I got a message from another Black man who lives in an over-policed community, and he's profiled a lot. And he said to me, if I had to file a complaint every time I got profiled, it would end up being the better part of a part-time job. I'm just always lucky to get out alive, and so I keep moving forward. So there's a reason. Attorney General, it looks like UMaine just got a chancellor who was the governor of Connecticut, who established a more robust data collection enforced in Profiling Act in Connecticut, and is therefore now a part of our system here. And so I'm just wondering if you might consider reaching out to him, even though this is no longer his job, simply to discuss what his experience was around the work he did in trying to end profiling in Connecticut, as a way to break down some silos across state government and get some advice and some expertise from someone who's right here at home now, and may be able to help going forward with our efforts.
So thank you for that. His name did come up as somebody that we would benefit from, as he was in a position to see this rolled out over his term as governor of Connecticut. We have, though, just to add, so I know for Connecticut, I'm not recalling on California, my chief deputy has spoken directly and at length with the person in the AG's office in Connecticut who's connected with this program, like the point person for this program. So I think it is going to be, there's opportunities for a number of different relationships to come from these states. You know, me talking with my attorney general counterparts, as well as folks in my office making those connections with the, you know, the implementing staff and other AG's offices who can help talk about how these programs can be done, and to learn from what, you know, and this would be the same thing that would be beneficial from Molloy is, what were some of the challenges that you had to overcome that maybe we can learn from to reduce the implementation of a system here so that we can get this up to speed, fully functional more quickly. This is a long way of saying thank you for that suggestion on Molloy. We were thinking about that. I haven't personally had that outreach yet, but we did connect with the relevant point person, at least in Connecticut. I think California too, but at least in Connecticut.
Thank you for that. And finally, as I've said earlier, profiling, to be profiled is to be humiliated and to feel terrorized and to feel as if you cannot move about freely without having to justify your being. So my question to you, even though you're not a judge yet, nor are you a juror in a trial, what would be, in your opinion, for any substantiated harm that has been caused to an individual by profiling, what do you think would be proper relief, justice for the individuals in targeted communities who have to deal with this every day?
Well, I'd want to think on that some more. I think at a minimum, it's removing the individuals or the structures that under the cloak of authority of the law have committed what is found to be a violation. Removing those individuals or sanctioning the institutions that allow that to happen or persist is one way. I can't say that I know exactly what those sanctions might be beyond termination or, in the case of, say, a 1983 action, maybe there'd be some damages associated with that. But that's the sort of easy answer. I can't say that I've thought about, first of all, we know that there's a problem. We know that we need to stop it. I guess I haven't thought quite far enough to say this is when we can be satisfied that the problem has been addressed, which I think includes what you're asking about. And I guess I'd want to think about that some more.
Yeah, thank you. I don't want to use the word, but I just think that people who have been aggressively harmed by over-policing and profiling deserve some type of recompense. And I don't know what that is, but I urge you to think that through as well as you deliberate this going forward.
Okay. Whoops. Thank you, everyone. I think we don't have anyone else asking questions. We've been all over the place in the past hour. I really want to thank all of you members. This has been, let me finish and then we'll have one more. Talbot Ross, did you have a question?
I'm so sorry. Thank you, Madam Chair. I can ask Commissioner Shostak more about this later. I wanted to find out, since tribal law enforcement officers are trained at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy, whether or not the curriculum at the Maine Criminal Justice Academy includes anything on tribal state relations, and particularly the Land Claims Settlement Act, and what the relationship is between state law enforcement and tribal law enforcement moving forward. So I'd like to get that question on record, and I can certainly follow up with the commissioner about the importance of including that kind of curriculum within the academy training. So thank you.
I have one more, and I will wrap up. Representative Cooper.
Thank you, Madam. Yes, here I am. Madam Chair, thank you. One of the few silver linings of the pandemic has been the lowering of incarceration in our jails and at Long Creek, and it's been quite dramatic. People in charge of those institutions have seen fit to release primarily to homes, and perhaps with ankle bracelets in the case of adults, rather than incarceration, where it's become dangerous for everyone to be in crowded situations. My point here is that they made those decisions based on risk to the community to which these people were being released. Why aren't we using the same criteria all the time? Thank you.
I don't know.
Why isn't it being used for the prisons as well?
I don't know if either one would be speaking about that, but I'll turn it over to either the Attorney General or the Commissioner if you wish to make a comment on that.
I'll offer the comment that the silver lining, as you put it, Representative Cooper, is it may very well be that because of COVID-19, we now have an experience that demonstrates that, when you arrest somebody, you don't have to take them right to jail. That, there are, where before a law enforcement officer or a judge who might hold somebody to the extent that somebody where bail is involved. I think what we're going to have at least 3, 4, 5, however many months of, we're now going to have an experience that shows that bail decisions or arrest decisions don't necessarily have to be heavily based on, I don't really have a good feeling about this, so I'm just going to take them in. So my hope, and I'm not in the position, I'm not the person directing, of course, how law enforcement agencies are doing this. Just my comment that we just did a report on task force on pretrial justice reform, and we talked about how bail is operating. It may very well be that now law enforcement agencies, courts, certainly defense attorneys are going to have more to talk about. Prosecutors are going to be able to have greater trust in saying somebody would be fine not having to worry about bail. I think we have an experience that's going to support a more liberal policy when it comes to whether or not somebody should be incarcerated pre-trial. And conversely, the extent to which somebody may be eligible for pre-release beforehand. I think that's an experience we'll be able to talk about to get to the point that I think you were making.
That's great. Thank you very much.
Again, we could be here all night if someone keeps pumping up to ask a question. And I know I don't feel I am cutting anybody off, or anyone, I should say. I would like to just extend that this is the current Criminal Justice Committee and the current Judiciary Committee. It was very important to have this gathering here today and to answer questions. A lot we already knew about, but this is for the public. This is looking into really what the policies are, the thinking is, and for every committee member, and you've done very well in expressing your views and asking very important questions. But come January or February, both the commissioner and the attorney general will be going before the respective committees and making similar presentations. So I can well imagine we'll be educating probably a new crew or some people. And that's something to be very aware of. Unless anybody else has anything they wish to say, I, again, heartfelt thank you to all of you for participating today and spending the day together. Away, but together. So, Representative Warren?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to also just say thank you to the Commissioner, thank you, Attorney General Fry, and thank you so much, committee members, all of you from the Criminal Justice Committee, the Judiciary Committee, who took your time to be here. I know you are so busy working and trying to answer all of the questions of your constituents, and just thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just like to also say thank you to the AG Fry, to being here today. Very good information, very well put, and just thank you for the opportunity to have this meeting and get this information together. We got a lot of work ahead of us, and I would echo also what the good senator just said as well. We have no idea who's going to be sitting in chairs around the horseshoes the first of the year. And we don't know if we're actually going to get back to the horseshoes this year. There's many of us would like to be back now, but the bottom line is we don't know if we will. So I'm sure we're going to have to we're just going to have to take this information and start working with it and working on it and being prepared for when we can actually do the work that needs to be done. Thank you very much once again.
I would entertain.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us. We appreciate it. Powerful day as expected. Take care.
Thank you. I move adjournment.
I second.
Those in favor, so moved.
Huh? Yeah, I know. And Megan wants to talk about